40-minute drive, and on the left of you on the highway for almost 40 miles is Boeing. And it's airfield after airfield, and hangar after hangar, and plane after plane, and they're taking off and flying all about. That, to me, is Boeing. And the fact when senior management left there, it seemed like for a lot of people, we kind of lost the heart and soul there. So,
and building off of Paul's earlier question, I'm curious, did it seem as though there was a stronger, more intense crackdown after all the hiccups that Boeing has seen this year? Or does this seem like it's kind of been a bubbling up point and it's finally bubbling over as to why workers are so unhappy?
Well, Boeing has had a lot of very public embarrassments, right, in recent times. And I think the employees are saying the executives are not protecting the company's brand and reputation, so we will. We are not okay with the quality control. We are not okay with the way that production has deteriorated over time, and so we are going to fight to do things the right way, because these are engineers who take a lot of value. They love the fact that they can produce some of the most high-quality machines in the world, right? They don't want to create garbage material anymore, so they're fighting for it. And I think this is something that will get resolved. It will absolutely get resolved. They're going to get back to the table, maybe a few more weeks. Some people say we're only at the halfway point. Either way, they're going to come together. Boeing will get back on track. I'm not worried about the future of the company.
Let's pivot a little bit away from Boeing, get back to another key issue, which I keep raising because I just wonder how things are evolving. Are people back in the office? What's the new normal? What's the new normal? When you
I guess we are.
When you talk to your clients,
yeah.
Are we in a permanent hybrid situation now?
No, I mean, right now, I think 2025 is going to be the year of forcing people back into the office.
Really?
Amazon just made an announcement that people have to be back 5 days a week. I think that is regressive thinking, if you want my personal opinion, because think of the language people use when they talk about return to the office, go back to the office. It's going backwards, as if COVID was just a pause, and now we can press play again and nothing's changed. But the reality is culture has changed. If culture is how people think and act, we had a major experience that evolved our thinking about how we can be productive. And I think companies that are forcing people back into the office are counting on some people to leave. It's a way to do layoffs without doing layoffs. And they're relying on activity-based management. It's easy to manage activity of your employees if you can see them at the desk. The more elevated way of leading a team is to manage to outcomes, and you don't have to be in the office to manage to outcomes. So companies that want the competitive edge on attracting talent from all over the nation, they're going to allow people to work from home, and companies that have a real estate bill that they're worried about, they're going to force people back into the office.
And I mean, are incentives enough? Is food and all the different things enough to lure people back into the office? Or do you think that a lot of people are really hard and fast, I want to be remote?
Well, it depends on the person, right? There are some people who are just excited to get back into the office. They want the kombucha Fridays and the Hawaiian shirt Tuesdays, or whatever it is that people do right now to, again, create quote-unquote culture. Those are not culture things. Those are just perks. They're fun. Ultimately, it's how are we making decisions? How are people thinking? How are we committed to the mission of the organization? And I can do that at home, or I can do that in the office. And I would ask, if you're questioning right now as a leader whether or not you should force people back into the office, is think about, what are the results we're trying to achieve? What are the shared beliefs within our team that are getting in the way of hitting those results, and what do we need those beliefs to be? And is working from home going to help drive those correct beliefs that will get us the results or not? That's really the deeper work of leadership, rather than, do we get people in the office 3 or 5 days a week? So that's arbitrary.
But you think that Amazon might be a little bit of a harbinger? We might see more companies.
Yeah, well, absolutely. But also, Amazon is not going to have trouble replacing people that they want, right? Because it's Amazon,
right?
And so there are companies like that that can do whatever they want, and they'll be able to hire. Other companies, they have to be a little bit more strategic about how they're going to attract talent.
Interesting. I guess it's just an ever evolving situation.
Ever evolving.
Here at Bloomberg, we're 4 days a week. I don't know. We'll see. I'm 5 days a week, working just fine for me. Jessica Kriegel, thank you so much for joining us. Jessica Kriegel, she's the Chief Scientist of Workplace Culture at Culture Partners, joining us live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, talking about Boeing and just kind of the workplace in general, kind of the evolving U.S. workplace. Looking at the markets, we have the S&P up about 13 points. That's 0.25%. The Dow's down 118 points. Thank you, IBM. That's about 0.3%. And NASDAQ, that's kind of the stalwart here today, up about 0.6%. The 10-year Treasury yield, 4.19%. Yields coming in about 5 basis points here. On the commodity space, WTI crude oil off about 1%, just below $70 per barrel. Some risk premium comes out of that global energy market. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got stocks higher for the first time this week, but the Dow does remain lower. The Dow slumping 129 points right now, dropped there just about 0.3%. S&P higher by 13, up by 0.2%, while NASDAQ, the composite index, up 116, up by about 0.6%. 10-year at 4.19%, with the 2-year that's yielding 4.04%. Gold up $17 the ounce, 27.32 on the precious metal, up 0.6%. And today a retreat for West Texas Intermediate crude oil, down 0.9%, 70.13 for a barrel of WTI. So stocks are trading mixed as investors sift through a slew of corporate results. American Airlines boosted its full-year profit guidance, highlighting progress rebuilding from a failed sales strategy while it grapples with persistently high costs. Shares of American lower little change, down by 0.1%. Southwest Airlines did report third-quarter profit that was more than double Wall Street's estimate. Shares, however, now slumping by 3.4%. And we cannot ignore the move in Tesla after earnings. Tesla right now at the best level of the session. Tesla stock surging now by 18.4%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is our Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pelleton, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Norma Linda, she's sitting in for Alex Steele today. I am Paul Sweeney. We are live in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. We're also streaming live on YouTube. So head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Podcast. That's where you'll find us. Let's take a look at the European banks here. We had some numbers for Barclays come out, third-quarter results. 5% increase in total revenue. That beat analyst expectations. Pre-tax profit soared 18%, driven by better-than-expected income from its two biggest divisions. Stock higher as much as 4.5% today to a 9-year high. So pretty solid numbers coming out of our good friends at Barclays. Let's break it down with Philip Richards, senior analyst for European banks for Bloomberg Intelligence. Philip, thanks so much for joining us here. It seems like a pretty good number out of Barclays. Break it down for us.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, it's basically across the board. There's no one line which is really blowing it out of the park. But I mean, revenues were ahead, as you mentioned there. Costs actually came in slightly lower than what we're expecting, and also credit qualities are holding up very well as well. And that's come below. So small beats in all those lines. And what I think that market is really happy with today is basically their two core divisions, the UK retail bank and their investment bank, are both beating estimates. And obviously that gives the confidence that the whole turnaround of the bank is underway.
So earlier results from the bank were lagging. Can you just kind of talk us through what exactly was bogging down not only Barclays but European banks more broadly? Were rates the central story here?
Rates are the big story and have been for some time for European banks. And as much as Barclays did well today, what we're really concerned about is, and also they raised guidance for the rest of this year, but that's already in consensus numbers. What we really care about is looking for next year, and where the earnings for these banks are going, and interest rate cuts, which are really coming through. And really has not been much guidance from that. And we've seen that for a number of the European banks which reported 3Q earnings so far. Yes, numbers are strong now, but what about next year? And that's what we really focus on, and that's where we're struggling with the guidance.
So Barclays, I mean, stock hitting a 52-week high here, still well off of the all-time highs back in the early 2000s, but a 52-week high here, up 60% year to date here. Is the bull call that, hey, the worst is behind some of these UK and European banks, and now I can focus a little bit more on fundamentals? What's driving the stock price performance of some of these banks?
Well, the real stock price has been very strong for a number of the banks over the last year and a half or so since interest rates really increased. And we've seen the whole sector rally more than 70% since the end of 2022. So the whole bank sector's been on this rally, but it's now a case of, will that start coming off as rates start coming back? And as I was saying before, that's the key driver for them. Now, Barclays have been doing well. A number of banks have been much more cautious. They've been cutting costs, restructuring, and basically shrinking back to try and hold on to profitability. But Barclays has been much more positive in terms of actually looking for growth opportunities. And they really outlined that at their investor day back in February. And they've really done much better than most of their peers since then.
All right, folks, just a reminder that in a couple of minutes, we're going to take a simulcast with Bloomberg Television. David Einhorn, Greenlight Capital founder. He's going to speak with Bloomberg Television's Shonali Basak. We'll bring it to you in just a few minutes.
I mean, I also just wanted to know, what is the next chapter of this story? I mean, as we are seeing rates pull back, does that just pretty much dictate a rally through the end of the year? What are people saying?
Yeah, well, I think its main story is on the investment bank. We know the UK retail bank is doing well. It's been performing with higher rates. But where is the stand in terms of the investment bank? It basically grew too big. Its share of assets of the overall group is well more than 50%. And that concerned a lot of investors. And also there's been concern that they've been losing market share, as have all the European investment banks, to the bigger US rivals. And so, Barclays positioned themselves saying, yes, but these large corporates, they don't want to have just US banks on the investment banking side. They want to have a European player there as well. So for them, Deutsche Bank, can they really, go out and get a position in those areas? So that's the real future for them. Can they really establish themselves as a fully fledged investment bank?
What do you think here, Philip? I mean, I think of Barclays and Lehman. To me, having spent my career on Wall Street, those are great blue chip names. I'm just not sure if they can be global banks anymore. What do you think?
I think you're right. Well, certainly when you say global, I mean, what they want to do is really dominate the domestic markets, and not just by UK, but also the European markets. I mean, Barclays are the one exception of European banks with a decent franchise in the US, but it's much more consumer-driven and bits of investment banking, and they're much more a niche player there. Where they're really by the biggest is obviously on the European side, and that's where they're really trying to hold their ground. And on that side, they are doing well. I mean, they are matching a number of the bigger US players on the European stage.
Hey, Philip, with about 30 seconds, I want to know, how does Barclays line up when we're looking at it amongst competitors?
Well, first of all, it's got that big investment bank, but it's got too big, and that's what they're trying to restructure, turn around, so where they can put it. They've also got this well-performing UK bank, and yet the shares are trading just about half book value, which is a very depressed valuation. So basically, something is not quite working together. The operating banks are doing well. Capital is also getting stronger as well. So basically, the bank's going in the right direction. Things have got a lot better over particularly the last 6 to 12 months. The investors are not yet really giving them the trust, the credibility that they're going to continue to deliver in terms of their targets.
Philip, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate getting your thoughts there. Philip Richards, folks, he's a senior analyst. He covers the European banks for Bloomberg Intelligence. He is based in our London studios. Talking about Barclays here today. Stocks up 3.8% on some pretty solid results. As Philip had been mentioning, the stocks have been rallying really in this higher interest rate environment, as they tend to do with better net interest margins. The stock, Barclays, is up 60% year to date, up 85% on a trailing 12-month basis. The other names have also performed very well, so we'll keep an eye on that, but some good numbers out of our friends from Barclays. In just a moment, we're going to bring in David Einhorn, Greenlight Capital, get his thoughts on these markets here. He sits down with Shonali Basak. Looking at the markets right here, S&P up 8 points, kind of hanging out here. The Dow's down 170, about 100 points of that decline is due to IBM, which had some weaker than expected results. NASDAQ up 100 points, that's a 0.5% here. The Bloomberg Dollar Index taking a little bit of a breather here today after having some strength over the last couple of weeks. It's off just slightly here, so we note that in the currency business. WTI crude oil, we're right sitting at $70 per barrel. That might be the new normal here in a world where we still have Mideast tensions raging. Right now, we're going to go to a really interesting conversation with one of the leaders on global Wall Street, David Einhorn, Greenlight Capital. He's the founder over there. He speaks with Bloomberg Television's anchor, Shonali Basak, get a sense of kind of where he sees these markets going, where he sees opportunities in the marketplace. That's coming up right now. Let's take a listen.
We want to now welcome our Bloomberg radio and television audiences right now. I'm Shonali Basak. Now, Bloomberg LP, the parent company of Bloomberg Television, is working with the Robin Hood Foundation for a stock-picking competition for $10,000 that will go to charity in order to fight poverty in New York. You pick a long and a short investment, and you can register through Monday, October 28th. You can sign up at robinhood.org. The competition is for charitable purposes only and does not constitute financial or investment advice. For more about the competition and his own investment choices, we are joined now by David Einhorn of Greenlight Capital. And perhaps first talk about this program for a minute, Pick a Ticker. You've essentially gamified charity. Why did you guys do it this way? You're closely involved with the Robin Hood Foundation. And what do you expect out of the program?
Yeah, we just thought it would be a little bit of a fun thing to do in conjunction with the annual Investor Conference that's been going on for 11 or 12 years. The idea is anybody who wants to participate can donate $10,000, pick a long, pick a short, see how it does over the next 6 months, and whoever wins gets to choose which Robinhood supported organization gets a chunk of the money.
Now, did you participate? Are you picking a long and a short for this game?
100%. Of course
What
I
are
am.
they?
Well, I'm not. The shorts people are allowed to keep confidential, and I'm going to keep mine confidential. But I'm going to pick Peloton, which is the stock that I pitched yesterday at the Robinhood conference.
Now, talk a little more about that, because from what I understand, you came dressed in full gear to make this pitch to the audience there. What is it about Peloton that you like right now? I understand that you said that it's undervalued, but what's the catalyst? Is it M&A or something else that you're looking at?
Well, I think there's a lot to like with Peloton. They have a large customer base that pays $44 a month and is extremely engaged, rides an average 13 times a month, and has very, very low attrition. So most subscription type models like this trade at really high valuations. Peloton has suffered over the last number of years because they thought they were going to be a much bigger company than they've turned out to be. Maturity has hit them a little bit sooner than they expected. And they had a cost base which was entirely based on, hey, the only thing that matters to us is revenues, because Wall Street values us on price to sales and stuff like that. And so, as I said at the conference yesterday, there's a lot of cost cutting for Peloton to do. Peloton probably needs to spend more time on the Peloton. And if they do that, the margins will improve a lot. And the stock is relatively inexpensive relative to other types of subscription model type of companies. Besides, they're going to get a new CEO who should be announced sometime relatively soon. And in the worst case, if they're not really able to turn around, this is certainly the type of company that there's a number of larger companies, I think, that would be very interested in owning this if it came down to that.
David, I also want you to weigh in over here. It's interesting. As we speak right now, Tesla had come out with earnings over the last 24 hours. The stock is up more than 19% at the moment. It's been a stock that you have been short before. Wondering what you think about this stock at this valuation here, and whether you would ever go short again.
Yeah, we don't really comment on our short positions anymore. We stopped doing that a few years ago. And so whether Tesla is a short or a potential short, it's not something that I'm going to discuss.
Can you speak to the valuation as it stands now and how it fits into the broader story around stock market valuations right now?
No, I'm really not going to go anywhere near that.
So let's talk about valuations more generally, because of course the AI trade in general has been a very hot one. I'm wondering if you think that if some of these stocks have gone too far and how you're playing the AI trade.
Well, the thing is we don't have to, bet against things that seem like they're expensive when there's so much excitement around them. So these stocks are very high. There's a lot of enthusiasm. There's been enthusiasm for a long time. I think the market as a whole is really, quite expensive, considering we're at a strong part of the economic cycle and we're about 23 times earnings. So it's hard to want to, for me as somebody who actually pays a lot of attention to what I pay for things, to want to chase those things. We do have a couple of companies that maybe have options on AI coming our direction. So for example, we own HP, which makes PCs. And PCs are due for a regular replacement cycle because a lot were bought after COVID in 2020 and 2021. And we could have a better than normal cycle if AI PCs turn out to be a thing. But that only trades about 10 times earnings, pays a 3% dividend. They're spending 100% of the free cash flow, returning it to shareholders. So you get about 7% buyback. So we can see, mid-teens, high teens growth for the next couple of years, just as you go through a cycle, share count reduction. And for this, you're paying just 10 times earnings, which is, very reasonable from our perspective.
I totally understand that you don't want to talk about individual short wagers. However, will you kind of explain the thinking around short investing right now? There are a lot of people who feel very burned in the way that markets have really melted up in a large way. What does the environment for shorting look like to you? And what are the kind of parameters that you think around?
Yeah, we're actually having a pretty decent year in our short book, particularly considering how much the market has gone up. We made a change a couple of years ago in response to sort of the meme stuff. And what we basically figured out is that the right tail for your best short ideas has changed. So it used to be I'd want to put the most money in whatever I thought my best idea is, but your best idea is probably something that you think is going to go to zero. And that's where the crazy stuff goes on. So we've kind of flipped the short portfolio in the sense that our bigger shorts tend to be more boring, and our smaller shorts tend to be a little bit more exciting. And it's enabled us to maybe manage the volatility relating to the occasional craziness that hits one stock or another, particularly in the more volatile, probably going to zero part of the short basket.
While we're talking about volatility as well, I know you this year had written to investors basically saying that it doesn't really matter who would win the election when it comes down to the markets more directly. But I am still really curious about how you're thinking about the election, less than 2 weeks away, uncertainty around how long it will take to know what the votes really come out to be at the end of the day. How do you think about that uncertainty and investing around it?
Yeah, look, I don't know how to handicap it. The only real projection I'm going to make about the election is it's going to be held on November 5th. And beyond that, it's really hard to know. The election seems to be very close. And, I don't know whether we'll have a winner anytime soon. I don't know whether either candidate is preparing to concede if it's a close election. So we'll just have to kind of see how that plays. I'm taking a relatively conservative posture into the election. I view this as a potentially uncertain event.
Is there anything that could take off after the election? And we hear over and over that investors are taking a risk-off tone before that time. So what starts to take off after?
Well, I think if you have a clear winner and it's in the country, it's clear what direction the country is going to go. I'm confident that investors will chase whatever is perceived to be a beneficiary of whichever candidate that happens to be.
I want to get your macro view on this as well, because a lot of people are worried about the direction of inflation. You saw the 10-year really trail higher in recent days. Some people think it's a Trump trade. What do you think about the direction of travel for bonds, the macro markets more largely on the heels of this election?
Yeah, I think that we've moved from a secular deflation for many, many years into secular inflation. And we've had a reduction in inflation from the peak from a couple of years ago, but I think a lot of that has kind of run its course. And so there's a decent chance we should have inflation reaccelerate, probably as soon as the next inflation reading. As far as I can tell, there's still rents that have to flow through. Commodity prices are getting stronger. And I think there's some other indications, labor prices still going up. You see what's going on, for example, with the Boeing strike. These wage increases are relatively substantial still. So I actually think that the deflationary period is kind of, the disinflationary period is kind of coming to an end. And I think that you can see it in the inflation derivatives market and you can see it in the bond market. Additionally, regular growth is pretty good. We're running about 3%. So if we've got 3% growth and we've got, at least 2.5% and maybe rising inflation from there, that's nominal GDP of 5.5 plus. It's hard to see why Treasury bonds at 4% or a little bit better than that are mispriced, or why rates should come down from that.
Another bet I know that you have had on, David, it's fair to call you a gold bug. We've seen gold hit record highs this year, and I'm wondering how much further you think it'll go and why.
Well, I think that gold, we've been long gold for about 15 years. So there's nothing new about me saying something interesting about gold. But I think just to the point I was just making, right? If we have the Fed that seems dependent on trying to reduce interest rates, even as inflation, maybe bottoming and about to reaccelerate, that should be pretty good for gold. And I think you're beginning to see that in the price of gold. And gold has had a really strong year. It's been a big help to us.
Last question for you before I let you go. There's been a lot of conversation about how you've been thinking about value investing, whether the industry has died or not, but a lot of people are looking to get back into that value trade, particularly that Russell 2000 value trade. What advice would you give them?
Well, I think with so many professional value investors no longer practicing their trade or having assets to manage, there's just a lot less competition. And so you can find some pretty exciting values in companies that are, less talked about or less exciting than the ones that everyone wants to, comment on every day that trade at, fancy nosebleed multiples. You have a real bifurcated market, and we can find companies that are paying large dividends and buying back lots of stock where we're going to make a good return just from the company giving us the money, and we don't really care what other investors do.
David. We got to leave it there. Of course, that is David Einhorn of Greenlight Capital, talking about his favorite long pick right now. We thank you very much for your time.
All right, that was David Einhorn, Greenlight Capital founder, speaking with Bloomberg Television's anchor Shonali Basic. Bloomberg LP has partnered with the Robinhood Foundation to launch a charitable stock picking competition, leveraging Bloomberg's expertise to benefit a good cause. Please note, the competition is for charitable purposes only and does not constitute financial or investment advice. Participants will select both a long and a short position over a 6-month period beginning this November. The competition is open to clients, and participants will compete on behalf of the charity of their choice. To compete, sign up at robinhood.org. All right, let's get a little bit of a reset here in this market. We'll go to Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much, and here's what's going on. We continue to see a mixed market right now, with the Dow lower by 209 points, drop there of 0.5%. S&P little changed, up 2 points right now, while NASDAQ is pushing higher, up 83, up by about 0.5%. Your 10-year 4.19%, the 2-year 4.04%, gold up $14 the ounce, higher by about 0.5%, 27.30 on gold, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.7%, 70.27 for a barrel of WTI. Tesla ripping higher after earnings, up now by 18.7%, just about the best level of the session, and UPS after earnings up by 4.9%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Norma Linda sitting in for Alex Steele. I'm Paul Swinney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're also streaming live on YouTube, so you can head over to youtube.com, search a Bloomberg Podcast, and that's where you will find us. Let's talk toys. Hasbro, they reported some results. Looks like they beat expectation. Yet the stock is down about 5% here trading. It is up a third 30% year to date, so it's had a good year. But let's check in with the analyst who covers Hasbro and all the consumer product stuff, Lindsay Dutch, consumer hardline senior analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. Lindsay, talk to us about Hasbro. What do we see from that toy maker in their quarterly results?
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me. So it was a strong quarter in terms of profitability, and a lot of that is coming from very aggressive cost cuts that Hasbro has implemented, I would say, over the past year or so. They also sold E1, a part of their entertainment business, which was very low margin, and they cut a bunch of toys that were also lower margin. So it's really kind of shining through. That's the positive. The negative, and I think what the stock is really reacting to this morning, is, the outlook when we think about toys is actually worse than they were expecting. And we're going to see that pressure kind of come through in the fourth quarter, when the toys is really the majority of their mix. And there's some pressure on some of their digital gaming businesses, which has always been, a shining star for them. So we're seeing that pressure coming forward, when they report fourth quarter.
So it's interesting. I'm always wondering how many of the young children are moving away from toys, since all of them have digital devices. I'm always watching at the different segments here. But as we think about Hasbro, as you said, it's not just about toys. They also have the gaming side of things. How does all this line up against different competitors like Mattel, for instance?
Yeah, so the digital gaming that Hasbro has is unique to them. It has been a strong business for several years. Magic the Gathering is not having its best year this year, very tough comps in the fourth quarter, but, kind of expecting to get back to stronger growth next year. But I think when you compare it to Mattel, they're much more toy heavy, really relying on sort of those strong brands like Barbie and Hot Wheels to drive Mattel results. But both of them are also highly linked to sort of entertainment and what's going on with media. So like Hasbro noted some weakness with sort of their Star Wars related products. They're seeing some weakness in action figures. I think a lot of kids still play with those toys, especially when you go down on the younger side of the spectrum.
What's the industry growing these days, Lindsay? Just kind of the generic toy business. Is that still a growth business?
So it is contracting this year. During the pandemic, growth really accelerated way ahead of GDP, which is sort of unusual for this type of business. So we've been coming off those highs now for a couple of years with, pressure in the industry and on Hasbro and Mattel. The industry is expected to sort of return to growth next year. I would expect that to be very low single-digit type of pace of growth. It's not going to be extraordinary. It's not sort of like a tech type sector. So slow, steady growth. Like I said, Hasbro has that digital gaming business that will be an above average growth driver for them. But I think the thing when you think about Hasbro is toys still counts for over 50% of their revenue. So you just cannot ignore that toy business when you're looking at the company.
How do we think about seasonality specifically with this sector and then also Hasbro as well? I mean, we're about to go into the Christmas season. I'd imagine that there's typically an uptick when it comes to purchases there. But I understand also the retail landscape, and we think about consumer spending. It's very, very interesting right now.
Right. So these toys makers, obviously the first half for them, when you think about toys, revenue is sort of like below the 50% of the mix type of environment, and costs are very high. Third quarter is probably when they ship the vast majority of their products to the retailers, Walmart, Target, because they have to have those goods in hand to sell for the holiday season. So third quarter is really, really big. We will still see some shipments into the fourth quarter, but a lot of the decisions on what toys are going to hit the shelves for the holiday season is already done at this point. But like I said, why that matters is because when we think about profit, which is really what the Hasbro stock is moving on, that mix shift for them swings very heavy to toys, which are lower margin, and in that second half. And so even though their margin looks really, really great through the third quarter, that pressure, in the fourth quarter is really going to weigh when the mix also swings away from the digital gaming.
What's the percentage of sales from e-commerce like Hasbro.com, Mattel.com? How is that for those two companies? Is that the faster growing channel?
So it's pretty low for them in terms of direct sales. I think, for Hasbro, they do have a website that, was presented about 2 years ago at an investor day, and it was sort of a budding sort of growth area for them. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done there in terms of direct sales, but there is a growing trend in toys that is positive called the kidult. Basically, older adults, 20 and up type of age range that are buying into the toy industry, and it is a growing area. And I think that cohort in particular, is a good audience for direct sales rather than, shopping at a Target or a Walmart. They probably want to go straight to Hasbro, and get sort of those collector items that they're looking for.
All right, Lindsay, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it. As always, Lindsay Dutch. She is a consumer hardline senior analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, looking at Hasbro, reporting some numbers today. A little bit of a beat, but stock off about 5% here today. Although, as I mentioned, it's up about 30% year to date, so a pretty good move there. Hasbro, again, up 30%, but Mattel down about 1% year to date. So interesting, the diverging paths there. S&P 500 pretty much unchanged on the day, off about 7 points. The Dow is off 280 points at 0.6%. The NASDAQ, although, is a little bit higher, up about 0.2%. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
it shows that Berkshire sold another 115 million shares of Apple in this last quarter. That's Berkshire's largest holding. And I think in that vein, we'll start with a question from Sherman Lamb. He is a 27-year-old Berkshire Hathaway Class B shareholder from Malaysia. And he asks, last year you mentioned Coca-Cola and American Express being Berkshire's two long-duration partial ownership positions, and you spent some time talking about the virtues of both these wonderful businesses in your recent shareholder letter. I noticed that you have excluded Apple from this group of businesses. Have you or your investment manager's views of the economics of Apple's business or its attractiveness as an investment changed since Berkshire first invested in 2016?
No, but we have sold shares, and I would say that at the end of the year, I would think it extremely likely that Apple is the largest common stock holding we have now. One interesting thing is that Charlie and I looked at common stocks or marketable equities or the things that people love to look at as being businesses. And so when we own a Dairy Queen or we own whatever it may be, we look at that as a business. And when we own Coca-Cola or American Express or Apple, we look at that as a business. Now, we can buy really wonderful companies in the market as businesses. We can't buy all of them. All of their shares. We can't buy 90% or 80% or anything like that. But when we look at Coca-Cola and American Express and Apple, we look at them as businesses. Now, there's differences in tax factors. There's difference in managerial responsibility, a whole bunch of things. But in terms of deploying your money, we always look at every stock as a business, and we have no attempt made to predict markets. We have no attempt made to pick stocks. I went through many years doing the wrong thing. I got interested in stocks very early, and I was fascinated by them. And I wasn't wasting my time because I was reading every book possible and everything else. But finally, I picked up a copy of The Intelligent Investor in Lincoln, and there was a few sentences in there that said much more eloquently than I can say it. But if you look at stocks as a business and treat the market as something that doesn't tell you, isn't there to instruct you, but it's there to serve you, you'll do a lot better over time than if you try to take charts and listen to people talk about moving averages and look at the Fed pronouncements and all of that sort of thing. And so that made a lot of sense to me then. And the way I've been allowed to deploy it, Charlie and I talked about this, of course, constantly. It's changed over the years as the amount of capital we have, and the kind that has changed and all of that. But the basic principle was laid out by Ben Graham in that book, which I picked up for a couple of dollars, and which basically said to me, "You've been wasting your time now, but maybe you can use what you've learned or been reading about and put it to better use." And then Charlie came along and told me how to put it to even better use. And that's sort of the story of why we own American Express, which is a wonderful business. We own Coca-Cola, which is a wonderful business. And we own Apple, which is an even better business. And we will own, unless something really extraordinary happens, we will own Apple and American Express and Coca-Cola when Greg takes over this place. It's such a simple approach that it's almost deceptive. Most things, if you keep working harder and harder at it, you learn a little more math, or you learn a little.
Volume grew for the first time in a long time within their domestic business is also telling me, that things might be a little better in 2025. So, we're pretty optimistic that demand should be increasing across most of the modes that we cover. And, 2025, in our view, is going to be a much better year than 2024 was.
And I do know back in about April, I remember that UPS became USPS's primary air cargo provider. Is that still a topic of conversation? How much has that really added to the business, if at all?
Yeah, so it is a great business win for them. FedEx walked away from it for various reasons, and UPS decided to pick it up. It's going to be consistent volumes at a consistently good margin. And, what they're doing is they're really restructuring their overall business. They've been getting out of businesses that are a lot more volatile. They just sold their freight brokerage business, which was called Coyote, to RXO. And then that was earlier last month. And then in 2021, they sold their less than truckload business, UPS Freight, to TFI. And those were not great businesses for UPS. And now UPS can really focus on being a parcel provider. And to answer your question, what that U.S. Postal Service business can also do, it's going to build density. And density is the name of the game in any transportation company. And so they can build off that density with other volumes.
All right, Lee, thanks so much for joining us. Always appreciate getting your expertise in all things logistics, railroads, trucks, the sea transport, the air transport. Lee covers it all. And again, his transports companies just can give you a real good insight into the strength of the overall economy when you can see kind of what types of goods are being transported all around the country and the world. So some good stuff there. UPS stock up 5% today. So some good numbers, maybe a little bit of a turnaround there for UPS. Looking at these markets right here, we're sitting right at 5,800 on the S&P 500, up just 2 points. The Dow's off 200 points. That's a 0.5%, 42,200. And NASDAQ up 84 points today. That's a 0.4%. 18,360 is the level there on the NASDAQ. 10-year treasuries, we are down a little bit in yield, 4.2% on the 10-year treasury. Norma Linda, thank you so much for sitting in for Alex Steele. Appreciate the help. Coming up, Balance of Power with Joe Matthew from Washington, D.C. That starts right now.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Washington, D.C.
This race is as close as it gets. Welcome to the fastest show in politics, where we have a new Bloomberg News swing state poll showing the presidential race all tied up in the 7 states that are going to decide this election less than 2 weeks from now. We'll get the numbers and the analysis from Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson with insights from our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributor, Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano is with us, alongside Republican strategist Maura Gillespie from Blue Stack Strategies. Later, both campaigns on the march, as we've been discussing, to capture the Latino vote. We're going to talk about the issues driving one of the most critical constituencies in this campaign with Melissa Morales, founder-president of Somos Votantes and Somos PAC. It's all up this hour after we set the baseline on Wall Street. For that, of course, we turn to our friend Charlie Pellet at World Headquarters in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Joe Matthew. The feeling indeed mutual. We have got the Dow lower, the S&P fluctuating right now. Was lower a couple of seconds ago, but right now little changed, up 2 points. The Dow, as I mentioned, down. We've got NASDAQ up 88 right now, up by about 0.5%. Russell 2000 index of small cap shares have been higher in the early going, down now by 0.2%. 10-year 4.20% with the 2-year right now, 4.04%. Gold up $15 the ounce, up by about 0.6%, 27.31 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 1%, just above $70 a barrel. Well under 2 weeks to go to the November election. So how is that playing into market sentiment and the selling that we have seen in recent sessions? Brian Nick is head of portfolio strategy at New Edge Wealth.
we really hate to attribute any market moves to things that are happening in politics with the election, but if you kind of map the 10-year, and you've probably all seen this graph on top of the betting odds in a number of different markets for Trump, they're moving basically in sync right now. So there is a sense, I think, that the markets are increasingly worried about some kind of fiscal risk. It's hard to pin down to determine exactly what the concern is, but some kind of fiscal risk that is causing the yield curve to steepen, especially with long-term rates to move up.
Brian Nick with New Edge. You can hear more of the conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Not just the election on investors' minds, but also earnings. A ton of them. Tesla, after earnings, now surging by 18.8%. Best level of the session. Tesla jumping after the EV maker reported surprisingly strong earnings. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host of Balance of Power, here he is, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Good to see you, sir, and welcome to the Thursday edition of Balance of Power. You made it to Little Friday. Thanks for joining us on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, where you can find us right now. Search Bloomberg Business News Live, and we'll meet you in the studio. Always keeping our live stream active from Washington to New York as we follow the candidates on the trail here. Thursday, it's the 24th of October. We're getting pretty close. And not a shock to see Donald Trump in Tempe, Arizona, or Kamala Harris in the state of Georgia. She'll be in Clarkston later for a big old bash. You see the lineup on this thing? They're adding more people by the minute, it seems. We told you Barack Obama was going to be there. Also, a guy named Bruce Springsteen. Samuel L. Jackson added to the rundown here. Tyler Perry we knew about. Spike Lee. And is this the Beyonce one, James? Does it one? Okay, so tomorrow we get the Beyonce. They're bringing out the big guns, much like we are here on Balance of Power. She's been at it for over a year. The boss of the poll, the Bloomberg Swing State poll, in conjunction with Morning Consult, there's one person in the newsroom who's had steam coming out of her ears for this whole process, and that's Wendy Benjaminson. She's with us back at the table here, Washington senior editor. Congratulations on a year of polls. We lived through a year.
Thank you. We did it.
And what did we find over the course of this year? This is really interesting to not only look at the snapshot, but look back at the trajectory of this campaign, which you're going to help us do right now. The fact of the matter is, the headline is this couldn't be closer, right? This race is tied in all the states that matter.
Yes, and when we say tied, sometimes we'll say there's a 3 or 4 point difference, but it's within the margin of error. This is tied. Yeah. This is 49-49.
There you go.
And in the individual states, it varies from 0.5 percentage points to 3.1 in Michigan, advantage Harris in that case. Right. But that's still within the margin of error. So, who knows? 50-50.
A 1% margin of error is about as low as they get.
It is.
Which this poll carries. This is a big sample.
Yes.
And so we can walk through some of the states. If you're with us on YouTube, you can see some of the charts here. You mentioned Michigan. This is the biggest gap we have at 3.1% advantage Harris. We don't have to go through the whole horse race here, but in a world where Harris picks up Michigan with a 3% advantage, that's pretty close to shutting things down, isn't it?
It's close, but then there's Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, as Hillary Clinton learned in 2016.
Right.
And at least Harris is giving more attention to those states than Clinton did. So we'll see what happens there. 3.1 is still within the margin of error, and that is still a very, very tight race. And we are seeing, she was counting on Arab Americans and Muslim voters to side with her over Trump, largely over Israel and over his immigration stances and things like that. But I've been seeing more reporting that Arab Americans and Muslims are not seeing her step away from Biden or step away, more pointedly, from Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, enough, and maybe leaning toward Trump, which would really surprise me, and we'll find out in the exit polls. But Michigan is just another ball that's up for grabs.
And of course, whether you're talking Michigan or Pennsylvania, any of these blue wall states, the economy is going to be so important. Any of the swing states. And you have found that Donald Trump still kind of owns this issue after all of the stuff that both campaigns have thrown against the wall in the last year.
Yeah. Now, Trump talks about the economy a lot. Harris was for a while. When she first got in the race, she came up with the caring economy and the opportunity economy, and she started talking about housing costs and healthcare costs, and her numbers went up. She has been on this closing argument that Trump is awful, that Trump is a fascist, that Trump is a threat to democracy, and all these things. He is still talking about the economy. And the race, as I've said, is very, very, very tight. Yeah. But in our poll, what is so amazing is that Democrats have used this argument that Trump is awful for 9 years. And it had failed miserably in 2016. It worked a little bit in 2020. I mean, Biden won, but still, they were still making this argument. And they're back to that argument now in the closing weeks. And our poll showed that voters know that. We asked about character traits, and by large margins, I mean 10 points in some cases, swing state voters say they believe he is dishonest, he is not compassionate, he doesn't care about people like them, he's too old, he's not mentally fit. She leads him on all those categories. And yet that's the man they want to steer the U.S. economy. And so if I'm looking at those numbers and if I worked for Kamala Harris, I would be saying, how about we talk about the economy? Because democracy is the fourth most important issue to voters. It is the economy at 36%. The next nearest one is immigration at 15%. And then it drops further to abortion rights and then democracy. So maybe if it's that close, talk more about the economy.
Take a hint?
Yeah.
This is the Take a Hint poll. Wendy, lastly, remarkable to see something else incredibly consistent for Donald Trump. That is his floor and his ceiling. They talk about, Fibonacci's when it comes to the stock market. He stays right in that channel.
He does.
No matter what happens.
Yeah, this poll has shown the most static electorate I think I've ever seen. Nothing changes. The man can say the most awful things. Twice people can try to shoot him. You'd think that would make his numbers rise up. That doesn't. Nothing he says seems to move the ball. And he just has the same number of people. Now, this is what Harris is trying to do now, is to try to get those Republicans who aren't crazy about him, especially Republican women, to come out and vote, to not just say, well, a pox on both their houses, I'm not going to vote. And the gender gap is tremendous. I mean, women really don't like Donald Trump, a large number of them. And if all of them go out to vote, more than sort of the young bros that Trump is trying to energize, who don't vote in his large numbers, then maybe she can pull it out. But
a lot more to find in the story itself, on the terminal and online. 2 weeks out, Trump and Harris locked in a dead heat with the help of Wendy Benjaminson. Find our poll now a year in with an enormous amount of data to sift through if you're interested in where this race is going. Wendy, thank you so much for all of your great work on the poll and helping us cover this campaign. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, and glad you're with us if you're just joining us on the Thursday edition of Balance of Power. Wendy said something important. After the economy, it's immigration. So how about we just take these two issues here and walk them into our next conversation, because this is something very important here that Melissa Morales has been following here as founder and president of Somos Votantes and Somos PAC, and both campaigns, of course, targeting the Latino vote, and through different visions and different messaging when it comes to the issue of the economy and the issue of border security and immigration. Melissa, thanks for joining us. It's great to see you. Welcome back. Are the campaigns doing anything to expand their bases, to actually draw new Latino voters into their fold?
Yes, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here and to talk about my favorite topic, which is Latino voters and where are they at and what are they doing right now. As you said, I lead a set of organizations called Somos Votantes and Somos PAC, which run some of the largest Latino civic and voter engagement programs in the country. And recognizing the essential role that the economy holds is a key issue for our Latino community. 3 years ago, I began partnering with the Winning Jobs Narrative Project, which has been this 3-year-long economic research project focused on how to better connect with people on the issue of the economy. So When we think about is either campaign doing anything to really broaden their bases, this issue of the economy really becomes key. You know, core to the Winning Jobs Narrative Project is the belief that working people, including hardworking Latinos, are the engines of the American economy. They're the true heroes of our economic story. That's how they should be centered, not just in the economic policies that we're talking about, but in the economic messaging as well. And 3 years worth of research from the Winning Jobs Narrative Project shows that that's the framing that really resonates with voters. It moves voters. And in regards to Latino voters, it's what they want to see in closing arguments down the stretch. You know, in the past month alone, Somos has talked to over 170,000 Latino voters across the country. And the question in Latino voters' minds, for a lot of them even still, is who can provide a clearly communicated vision for the economy, and how do I specifically fit into that vision? So we've heard a lot of that from Kamala Harris. We've heard concepts of those plans from Donald Trump, but how those economic policies are communicated down the stretch in this final 2 weeks is going to be very important.
Well, we're talking about the largest racial or ethnic minority in the country here. And so you have people like me going on the air asking questions about something called the Latino vote. And I know that you're entertaining my questions here, and I really appreciate that, Melissa. But the fact of the matter is you've been on the ground, I understand, in a number of states around the country talking firsthand with voters: Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania. The Latino vote is not a monolith. You're talking about a lot of different people who grew up in different circumstances and have different ideas about what the economy means to them, what conservative means, the role that religion plays in their lives. So take us to school on the groups that we should be paying attention to.
Yes, I think what's really interesting is, that we hear this a lot, that Latino voters are not a monolith. You have pockets of voters in different states. Latino voters in Nevada look a lot different than Latino voters in Pennsylvania. But at the end of the day, the through line here with Latino voters is really this concept of the economy and what it means for them, which is, can I afford to take care of my family at the end of the day? And what does our future look like economically in this country? And that includes a lot of the things that we've heard Vice President Harris talk about. You know, can we provide the tools and opportunities that Latino families need to build a good life for themselves and their family? That's the small business loan she's talked about. A big thing we have heard from voters is about home ownership. You know, I think in polling, you sort of get this static answer. What do people care about? We've heard housing costs, and in our minds, that translates often to rent, which is certainly true. People think that rent is high, but the real question underlying that is that Latino voters feel like they work very hard. They want to own a home someday, and right now that dream feels very out of reach. So can someone speak to that, which we have seen Vice President Harris do a lot down the stretch. So when we think about the economy, both the vision for the economy that Kamala Harris has set out, the vision for the economy that Donald Trump has set out, where Latino voters really converge is in this, is either side talking about the tools and opportunities that my family needs to be able to build a good life. And that's foundational, no matter what group of Latinos that you're talking about.
Well, we've got our new Bloomberg News swing state poll out today, Melissa, and it zeroes in not only on the horse race in the swing states, but issues as well. And this is still Donald Trump's to lose on the economy based on what we've seen now for an entire year of monthly polling in partnership with Morning Consult. 50% of swing state likely voters say they trust Donald Trump more to handle the economy. 45% say so for Harris. If the economy is the number one issue in the Latino household, isn't that advantage Trump?
So a couple of things that I would say on that. And one is that when we look at polls of likely voters, we are missing an entire segment of the electorate, and especially the Latino electorate, of voters who may be unlikely to turn out, but that's exactly what Somos is working to do right now, is to turn out those more unlikely voters. I think we want to be able to look at the whole here. And the second is that I will see you a poll and I will raise you a poll, which is that, I think, yes, definitely, in the past, Donald Trump, the Republicans have had this advantage on the economy specifically. Eki's research released a poll yesterday, which shows that while the top line show a very stable race for the Latino community in particular in a Trump versus Harris matchup, where we have seen movement is this undercurrent of who people trust more on the economy. And we have actually seen Vice President Harris take the lead in this latest poll on who Latino voters trust more on the economy. And if I was Vice President Harris, that's certainly a dynamic I would be holding on to and optimistic about headed into Election Day.
It sounds like you might agree with the analysis we just had from Wendy Benjaminson. And yeah, in our final week and change, spend time talking about the economy as opposed to a threat to democracy. Do you see it that way?
You know, I think when we think about things like a threat to democracy or reproductive rights, other things we have seen Vice President Harris spend time on, I think those things go hand in hand with the economy. You know, we cannot have a stable economy, either domestically or globally, without a stable democracy in the United States. So those two things really go hand in hand. So I think we can focus on more than one thing at the same time. And in the sort of global economy we live in the economy across states, you know, interstate economy that we live in, a stable democracy and a stable economy go hand in hand.
Melissa, it's good to see you. Thanks for being part of our conversation and bringing your work at Somos Votantes and Somos PAC to us here on Bloomberg. Melissa Morales, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Much more ahead. Mike Dorning will join us from Bloomberg.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P. They are both lower right now. NASDAQ holding on to a gain of 0.2%. S&P declining. Choppy trading. Traders parsing a slew of corporate results for clues about the health of the U.S. economy. Treasuries rebounded after days of losses. S&P right now down 8 to 57.89, a decline of 0.1%. Dow Industrials down 302, down 0.7%. NASDAQ up 52, a gain of 0.3%. 10-year 4.19% with a 2-year 4.03%. Gold up $12.50 the ounce, 27.28 on spot gold, up by 0.5%. And a retreat for West Texas Intermediate crude holding just above $70 a barrel, 70.03 right now. It is down by 1%. Earnings news, lots of reports this morning. American Airlines boosting its full-year profit guidance. We've got shares of American, those slumping by 1.3%. Also reporting earnings in the airline sector this morning. Southwest, it reported third quarter profit more than double Wall Street's estimate. A needed boost as the carrier tries to shore up financial results following that bruising fight with activist Elliott Investment Management that has come to an end. Southwest shares down now by 4.2%. Tesla surging after earnings. Tesla up now by 18.8%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Live from New York, Charlie Pellet, the voice of the New York subway and the stock market, for that matter. He's part of this program every day. I'm surrounded by the best people in the business, which means you are too. And so thank you for joining us here on the radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. You'll see what Charlie Pellet really looks like. So it's the poll day around here. The whole building shook around 6 o'clock last evening, the last poll in the series. Or is it? It's definitely a year's worth of polls, and it's the last one before the election. So how about that? We've been doing this every month with Morning Consult for a year, October to October. The Bloomberg News Swing State Poll finds just exactly what we've been talking about to be true. It is tied. When we say tied, we mean 49-49 tied. And when you break it down to the states, not a lot different. There are a lot of one-point races there. You've got maybe an outlier. I don't know, Harris up by 3 in Michigan. That just jumps off the map. And if you're with us on YouTube, we're showing you that right now. But, you know, you've got half-point races in Arizona, in Nevada, in Wisconsin. So people who tell you they know how this is going to end probably don't have a lot of credibility. That's why we like to talk to people with experience like Mike Dorning. He's with us right now as the closing arguments are crystallized. Bloomberg News political editor and reporter. Great to see you, sir. You getting excited like you're coming up on Christmas here? Like
There's still a little, some days to go, but each side is going to be really pushing this next week. Mm-hmm. And this is an exciting time because we know that in terms of what people think, it's basically tied. Yeah. So it all depends on whose voters are more likely to come out to the poll. Mm-hmm. Which side can get their voters to turn out in a little bit higher numbers. And that's where you're going to win this thing, is who can get their people more motivated. And probably in the very end, we're going to see Russian, Iranian, Chinese-backed, other-backed, like disinformation campaigns, spreading lies that look like real news, trying to rev people up, tell them it's the wrong day for polling, all sorts of tricks like at the very end. So it'll be a rocky ride this few days.
Boy, you know, again, speaking from experience, and that does sound like the case, and we should just do our public service announcement right now, Mike. We're not going to know that night who won the presidency. We might not know who won or controls the House. In fact, it could be days.
It often takes a while for the House. Yes. For the presidency, you know, last time it was, I think, 4 days. It was well into the week. It would not be shocking to me if the presidency took a while and the House took a while. It might be more likely that we figure out by the end of the night who's going to control the Senate, although even that's not for sure.
I want to ask you about the phenomenon that we see with voters who want to pick a winner, right? You said sometimes that motivates decisions. You want to align yourself with the candidate who has momentum and is more likely to win. And I bring this up because a plurality of swing state likely voters in our new poll think Kamala Harris will win the election. Is this a story potentially of self-fulfilling prophecies? What does that tell you?
Well, I think it's potentially significant, but I wouldn't read too much into it. Sometimes when you ask who's the likely winner, they might be more likely to tell you who they're really voting for than if you ask them who they're voting for, because for some reason they might not want to say it out loud. Another reason is it might be it's a way of getting at what their friends and neighbors are telling them. So you're essentially getting a larger sample that way.
Right.
But it can be kind of washed out because if there's a media narrative or a media narrative in whatever they happen to listen to that's telling them one thing, that can sort of wash out the value of that.
Sure.
Sometimes.
We remember the Bradley effect as well as an issue in polling, and having the first female black nominee could lend itself to that when people don't necessarily want to be honest with pollsters because they want to say something politically correct. Is that still part of the game here?
It could be part of the game, and that's one
reason.
reason.
LA mayor's race a long time ago.
Yeah. Here you have actually them saying they're more likely, they think that the African American women would run. The Bradley effect would suggest it would turn out the opposite way.
Correct.
But in theory, it might be, and this is just a maybe, it could be there's some suburban Republican people who are like, oh my God, I do not really want to vote for Democrat, but I don't want to vote for him, and I'm going to vote for her to stop him, but I don't really consider myself someone who would back someone like a Democrat for president.
You do wonder when you see poll after poll like this showing a tied race, if that has a motivating factor within the organizations. You're calling this a turnout race because it is one.
Yeah.
You see another log on the fire from Bloomberg today, and you say, we got to get the troops out. Does that actually motivate volunteers, door knockers, et cetera?
Yes, it does motivate them. They know it's a turnout race. It does motivate them. And that's why you're seeing some of these big events in the coming days that aren't even in swing states because they're galvanizing events. Trump playing Madison Square Garden. I don't know if he's played Madison Square Garden before. That's like a lifelong dream. Harris, who knows that abortion rights is a big motivator, going to Texas to rally people there with Beyonce to talk about freedom and abortion rights. Trump going to Texas to talk about the border. No one seriously thinks that Texas is in play for the presidential race. But they're going there for drama, for excitement, for enthusiasm, and that's what they both need.
I love it. I love this, Mike Dorning, on the eve of an election. It's great to have you back, as always.
Great to be back.
Look for his work, of course, on the terminal and online. He's editing our coverage here in Washington, and he's covered a couple of elections in his time, so it's great to have Mike Dorning with us on Balance of Power. I made a reference, we were talking about Madison Square Garden the other day, as I made a Led Zeppelin reference. Everyone around me looked at me like I was from another planet. Song remains the same, guys. Jimmy Page. All right, we'll go with the Billy Joel references from now on at Madison Square Garden. One of the other big stories we're following today is coming out of Boeing. Did you hear this? They rejected the contract offer. This is when we turn to George Ferguson for help. He's the analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence who's been covering this story. What a year for Boeing. And George is back now with, I'd say, the greatest hits, George, but it seems to be the opposite here. We had earnings from Boeing yesterday, a pretty brutal situation here. And only hours later, the union rejects the contract offer. What can you tell us about this situation today?
Yeah, I guess no break for the new CEO, Kelly Ortberg, right? So I think some folks hoping that maybe the change at the top would have smoothed relationships with the union, maybe brought them to approve the contract that they were voting on last night. Didn't happen. So very challenging, right? So he needs those union workers back in the factory so he could build the 737. He wants to build all his commercial airplanes, but the 737 most important. Highest cash generator, profit generator for the company. Look, union rank and file, it seems like even maybe a bit detached from their leadership. Their leadership wouldn't even sort of recommend a vote on the contract last night. They just said, "Hey, worthy of your consideration. Come on in and let us know what you think." So they weren't trying to steer the rank and file. Rank and file rejected a 35% increase, sweetened 401k. I think the rank and file feels like they ought to be close to a 40% increase, and they want a pension, right? And it's really, you can't make the airplane without these 33,000 folks. It's just, this is challenging, manufacturing. It's not automated manufacturing like an auto plant. Right. So Kelly's got to find a way to bring these people back and have them happy enough to build airplanes, with high quality. So he's got a challenge ahead of him.
This sounds demoralizing. I mean, the pensions aren't coming back, George, unless we take a time machine to the 1980s or something, right? So how long could these plants be on mothballs?
So, I mean, I would think at some point, the union rank and file would, they'd be stretched by the fact that they're not getting paychecks and be ready to come back. I feel like where you are now is that, Boeing came pretty far down the road to their demands. I feel like probably, Boeing has to give them a little more time to let them really think about how important that pension is. Right, so maybe you give them a couple of weeks to think about it. Let them manage their day-to-day finances, and then put an offer up that's maybe got a slightly higher pay increase, and maybe some more benefits in the 401k, and see if that doesn't soften them up.
The stock chart looks brutal here, as I'm sure you can attest. What does it mean for Boeing's airline partners in our remaining moment here, George?
We're watching U.S. Airlines earnings season come through, and fares are falling at most of the carriers. They're all sort of slimming down their capacity growth. So right now, we don't see a problem, especially in the U.S. But I think as you get into next summer, that'd be when you might show more problems if this strike extends and they can't get the plants restarted sooner rather than later.
That door jam, the door blowout, was last January, right? Wasn't that the very beginning of this year? That's how Boeing started 2024.
Yes, and I think everybody thought this would have been a strong recovery year, but honestly, the bad news has been flowing ever since the 2018 crashes of the MAX, and so this has been a very challenging,
a hellish year for the company.
5 years.
Somebody's going to look smart buying this year, aren't they, George? I mean, if you're a young person, is this an opportunity?
Well, look, I think that the challenge here becomes Boeing is really low on cash, right? And so now I think they have to come to market and raise more equity. You could see more dilution in the stock price.
That's the honest take from George Ferguson at Bloomberg Intelligence, one of the best in the business covering this story, and another tough break for Boeing. We'll keep tabs on the standoff here. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We'll assemble our panel next. This is Bloomberg.
11:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Just getting word from Apple that it, yes, is planning a week of announcements relating to the Mac computer lineup. That from its marketing executive, Greg Joswiak. In a social media post, he did not specify what products Apple will be unveiling next week, but Bloomberg News has been reporting that the rollout will include the first Macs with M4 processors. Apple shares right now down 0.4%. Stocks trading mixed right now. We've got the Dow lower, choppy session down 210 points, drop there of 0.5%. S&P swinging between gains and losses, up 6 now, up by about 0.1%, while Nasdaq is up 101, higher by 0.6%. 10-year at 4.19%, the 2-year 4.04%. Gold up $15 the ounce, up 0.6%, and West Texas Intermediate crude holding right around $70 a barrel, 70.04, down now by 1%. New home sales are running at the fastest pace in more than a year, and with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Home builder incentives, along with lower loan rates, are fueling demand. Mortgage rates dropped in September to the lowest in 2 years, and the Federal Reserve is expected to keep easing. It's been a long road. The supply of new homes on the market as of September is high, the highest since 2008. Home prices remain an issue. They're 30% higher than just before the pandemic. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
UPS shares up now by 4.7%. UPS returned to sales and profit growth for the first time in almost 2 years. And new research finds patients taking Novo Nordisk's Ozempic are at significantly reduced risk of being diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Novo Nordisk ADRs down now by 1.2%. Again, recapping choppy session, the S&P swinging between gains and losses, holding on to a 5-point gain right now, up by about 0.1%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues. Once again, your host, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Watching Wall Street for us every day here on Balance of Power. The fastest show in politics carries on from Washington on the radio, on the satellite radio, and on YouTube, where you can find us right now. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. You can follow along on your home game in so many different ways, and we'll add our global television audience to the conversation coming up at the top of the hour. We do this for 2 hours every day, and we have 12 days to go. We have been talking about this race for years, and we're almost there with what is now the last Bloomberg swing state poll before the election. I think there might, is that true? There might be another one after the election? Because, you know, the election doesn't end with the election, as we've been reminding you. The 9-week slog between Election Day and the 6th of January could be a bumpy ride. But as of right now, everybody's guessing, and that's all they're doing, because if they think they know who's going to win this election, I don't know where you get that crystal ball, but we haven't found one yet here at Bloomberg. It is tied 49-49 on the top. That's your headline when we average out the 7 states here in our poll. When you drill down, it's interesting. We do see actually some movement in Michigan here with Harris up 3. Otherwise, it's pretty much 1-point race wherever you look. It's even less. Wisconsin, Donald Trump up by 0.3%. Are you kidding? So let's assemble the panel and get their take on these numbers. Jeannie Shanzano is with us, of course, Democratic analyst, Bloomberg politics contributor, political science professor at Iona University, and our in-house expert on polls. Joined today by Maura Gillespie, founder and principal, BlueStack Strategies, Republican strategist and veteran of Speaker Boehner's office. It's great to see you both here, Maura and Jeannie. Jeannie, I kind of don't even want to ask you a question because I don't want to color your analysis in any way. You've got the same numbers in front of you that I do. What's jumping out?
What's jumping out is I don't think we have the metaphors in the English language or potentially any other metaphor to describe this in any other way except incredibly close. I keep thinking, you know, high school, junior high elections when you know you need 5 more people to get you to win. That's basically what we're down to at this point. That said, there is some really interesting things in this poll. You know, what jumps out at you, of course, is the number one issue continues to be the economy. And, you know, democracy way down 4th there. But I would say even more important than that is the fact that as we look back over a year of this poll and so many of the other polls, is how very little things have changed. We have a change of candidate at the top of the Democratic ticket, and she did push it back to where it was before. But beyond that, this is an intractable race, and nothing seems to move the needle.
Intractable. And we don't have Tracy Flick to call right now, Jeannie. If you've never seen the movie Election, do Jeannie and I a favor, and do yourself a favor and watch it this weekend. Maura, tied, too close to call. To Jeannie's point, describe it however you want here. But this is either candidate's race to lose. How do you see it?
I mean, that's where the American people are, right? I think it's reflective of the fact that people are frustrated with how things have gone in the last 4 years, but they also do not know what a Trump presidency would do to this country. And so I think there are a lot of voters who feel very conflicted. And so when there are pundits out there that say that they don't believe there's undecideds, they're wrong. There are undecideds, because for the top of the ticket, there are still just really big concerns of, do I trust either candidate to do the job? And for Kamala Harris, will she do what she's saying she's going to do now? Despite the fact that President Biden, who promised us he would bring us together and be a centrist, largely didn't do that? Or do you go with Donald Trump, who has shown us a cognitive decline rapidly, and also, not to mention, we could go on and on about the reasons why we don't trust Donald Trump, but it becomes a question of your lifestyle and the economy, safety and security. And so what are you voting for is really going to end up being what, I think the outcome turns out to be, is what voters individually go into the voter booth thinking, okay, here's what I'm voting on. Not personality, not policy, but either one. So it just depends on how they go into the voter booth. But it's that razor thin. And to Jeannie's point, I don't know at this point what would move the needle from the diehards.
Well, so here's the push and pull, because it's all playing out here in the questions and answers, Jeannie, in this poll. When asked which candidate is best described as mentally fit, honest, and compassionate, swing state likely voters choose Harris by wide margins. They were also more likely to label Donald Trump as too dangerous. But when you look at the most important issue on the list, you already mentioned it, Jeannie, it's the economy. He leads Kamala Harris by 5 points. And so what do you do with that?
I think we are seeing what happens with that. And, I look at the difference between these two campaigns. So Kamala Harris and her team are looking at that and doing what you'd expect the campaign to do. We don't win on the economy, so we are going to talk about areas where we have more success. The areas for those who haven't decided yet are clearly, we don't want another term of Trump. We think he's unfit, the fascism argument, all of that. And then second to that, freedom, reproductive rights, healthcare. Those are the two big things where they think they can have success. If you're Donald Trump campaign, you're going to look at that and say, you need to focus like a laser beam on the economy. People trust you more on the economy. But the problem is Donald Trump is not disciplined enough to do that. So where he's winning on the economy, we're not hearing that out on the campaign trail. And I'm not even going to go there, Joe, but what happened in Georgia the other day, was it yesterday? I'm losing track of time. Wasn't a disciplined message on the economy. And so, I'm sure his campaign team wants him to do that, but both the surrogates at this point and Donald Trump don't seem to be listening to that.
Well, we are going to go there, Jeannie, because I feel like what happened in Georgia is an important part of the story. I mean, look, we're not here to sane wash or any of the stuff that the media is accused of, but if you're going to put Tucker Carlson on a stage as part of your closing argument, and he's going to do the daddy routine like we saw last night, dad is home and he's pissed, I believe he said. You've been a bad girl and you're getting a vigorous spanking right now, is actually what he said. We'll have it in his own words in our second hour here, Maura. But what's going on in a campaign that is struggling with women when that is the takeaway message in a closing argument?
For the audience that can't see my face right now, I am cringing so hard, even just having, I'm sure you are too, having to have read that out loud, because it is just so embarrassing. And Tucker Carlson, again, these are people who Trump has said that he will put around him. These are people who would likely get cabinet positions. If that doesn't terrify you listening, that Tucker Carlson could have a cabinet position in the White House, should Trump win, it should. because I think it is certainly not going to help Republican women jump on board to be on that team. But I think also it just shows you the ego of the people that Trump is surrounding himself with Elon Musk, with Tucker Carlson, with Vivek Ramaswamy. They're all just looking to stoke flames, stoke your fears, and play on your insecurities so that you'll vote for them and they will line their pockets. And that's the unfortunate reality. And congressional Republicans down ballot need to separate themselves from that, because their policies, the ones, that poll that's showing that Trump is trusted more on the economy, it's not Trump. It's the people around him, who were around him, who no longer will be should he win, because those people who helped our economy, spur our economy in those first years of the Trump presidency, are either saying that he is not fit to serve and should be nowhere near the White House again, or have completely separated themselves from the Trump orbit. And that should be telling. So congressional Republicans are the ones who you're looking to spur the economy and to get things moving. And that's where the effort should be focused, not on the likes of a Tucker Carlson creeping us all out.
Well, Jeannie, that was a packed stadium last night. There were a lot of women. It was not just white guys cheering on and chanting "Dad." What was it? "Dad's back" was the chant last night. Maura describes it as creepy, but it got a lot of people on their feet. It certainly has helped to solidify. Look at this poll here. Donald Trump hasn't gone below 47% or above 49% in a year. This group is locked. And I don't know how you describe the tone in the room last night. You can take a swing at that if you want here, Jeannie, but what's the result in the election? Is it another 47-49 spread for Donald Trump? Because these campaigns are supposedly trying to expand their base.
Yeah, Joe, I'm still struggling, and I'm so glad you went to Maura on this first. Thank you, Maura. I'm still struggling to get over you doing that rendition of reading that, Joe. Never thought I'd heard that. I'd hear that from your lips.
I was hoping I could play it for you, Jeannie, but sometimes you got to go to war with the army you have.
You were amazing. So listen, it is creepy is one word, misogynistic, paternalistic. And by the way, Joe, the statement I think was not, and I can't believe I'm going to say this, "Daddy's back," but "Daddy's home." And so this would be very Jack Nicholson. And so, this is them doubling down on these polls, which is this huge gender gap. He goes tomorrow on Joe Rogan. He is not going to be talking about the economy like we would suggest, but he is going to be talking about issues that he thinks could get out these very few 4% or less undecided voters, or in this case, voters who are unlikely to get out regularly, and young men. So this is what they're going at. And you heard it all over Tucker Carlson last night. By the way, Tucker Carlson back again on the stump with Donald Trump on Halloween of all days. So I'm hoping he has the axe and he is doing the whole "Daddy's home" from The Shining, and we get the full rendition. If they're going to go out this way, I want him to go out big, Joe Matthew.
Well, everybody's going out big, apparently. My God, they've got not only Barack Obama, Bruce Springsteen for Kamala Harris, Beyonce's added to the list. They've got Samuel L. Jackson, by the way. I mean, how are you going to top that? Tyler Perry. This is all, of course, with a couple of the names I just mentioned, at least, Maura, about a battle for young black men. We have to acknowledge the fact that Donald Trump has made inroads here that Republicans have not been able to make before. What is he doing right?
Again, I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that I think a lot of the policies at the far left went too far. And I think they know that. And last night, I think there was an opportunity for Kamala Harris to say, we did some things wrong, and here's what I want to do to make it better. I'm vice president, and as president, here's what I would do. I think it's okay to say that at this point. You're 2 weeks away. You've got to admit some things and be honest with the American people. And I think for some voters, I think for men, they see that Trump is honest. You may not like what he says, but he's honest, at least to them. That's how he presents himself, as a straight shooter. I don't think he very much is, because I think he just says what the current audience he's in front of wants to hear, and then he gets kind of confused about where his actual policy stances are. But to what they're seeing on the other side is, vague terms and being placated, where they want to actually know, what are you going to do to help make our lives better?
Maura Gillespie and Jeannie Shanzano, stay with us. Our panel will have much more in our second hour. And yes, we'll actually play what I guess Tucker Carlson said in his own words this time. I did my best on that. By the way, You ever trusted anyone who ever referred to themselves as daddy who was not actually your parent? A lot of people like daddy's home, whatever. Yeah, daddy's. Maybe that in itself is an indicator. We'll have more on this coming up on the fastest show in politics as we add Eli Yoakley to the conversation. Political analysts from Morning Consult, our partners in the Bloomberg News Swing State Poll, will have the numbers for you and the breakdown with less than 2 weeks to go, right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
It's all tied up with less than 2 weeks to go. Welcome to the fastest show in politics, where our new Bloomberg News swing state poll finds a presidential race that is too close to call in the 7 swing states that will decide this election. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Welcome to the Thursday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kaylee, it's interesting here. The race is tied, and when we say tied, 49-49, but Donald Trump still leads on the most important issue in this campaign, and of course, that's the economy.
Yeah, 50% of swing state voters say they trust more Trump's handling of the economy than Harris's. Only 45% said the same for her, and that's even as voters are more likely to say that Harris is honest and fit for office.
Yeah.
A lesson here, perhaps, that it is not about fitness for office. It is in these final days of the race about the economy. And yet that's not the closing messaging we're necessarily hearing from the Harris campaign. Harris, in a town hall last night on CNN, says she agrees that Donald Trump is a fascist.
A fascist? Well, we had Tucker Carlson on a stage with Donald Trump in the swing state of Georgia, also not seizing on an economic message. There was something about daddy. We'll get into that with our panel later on. But the closing messages continue to evolve in interesting ways in this campaign, reminding us that this is not like one we've ever seen before.
Certainly not. And of course, we'll hear more of the closing messages tomorrow. Both of the candidates will be in Texas. Harris talking about abortion with Beyonce at her side in Houston. Donald Trump will be in Austin talking about immigration and the border, which is another issue that ranks highly on voters' minds in these battleground states. So we'll have much more ahead on this polling and the state of the race. But we begin, as always, with a check on the markets. Charlie Pellet has a look from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much. And lots going on today, Kaylee Lines. Lots of earnings. We've got stocks fluctuating right now. The Dow is lower. S&P, NASDAQ, they are both higher. Again, the S&P has been fluctuating between gains and losses right to the numbers with a 9-point advance right now. 58.06 on the S&P, up by about 0.2%. The Dow down 182, down 0.4%. NASDAQ up 113 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, a gain right now of just about 0.6%. 10-year 4.19%, the 2-year 4.04%. Spot gold up $19 the ounce, up 0.7%. 27.34 the ounce on the precious metal. West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.1%. 69.95 on WTI, falling back below $70 a barrel. Look at Tesla shares now surging by 20% after the EV maker reported surprisingly strong earnings, and it forecast as much as 30% growth in vehicle sales next year. Again, right now we got Tesla up by 19.9%. Boeing shares down 1.9%. Member of the Dow, Boeing factory workers rejected a new labor contract that would have increased their wages by 35% over 4 years. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues, the Thursday edition. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, Charlie Pellet with a look at the markets. Thank you so much. I'm Kaylee Lines alongside Joe Matthew in Washington with a look at our latest polling from Bloomberg and Morning Consult, the final one we will see of this election, which is now just 12 days away, of our poll in the battleground stage, which, as we've mentioned, shows that this is a dead heat, not just statistically speaking within a margin of error. It is literally a tie, 49-49, Trump-Harris. When you look at the state-by-state breakdown, Joe, you do see there are some standouts. Harris, for example, is up by a little over 3 points in Michigan, by 1.7 in Pennsylvania. But in some of these states, like another blue wall state, Wisconsin, Trump up by 0.3 percentage points.
It's a 3/10 race.
This is literally a coin flip.
Well, yeah, and you know, I'll remind everyone that we've been doing this poll for a year now.
Yeah.
This is an October to October story. So when we talk to Eli Oakley in a second, keep in mind we have a year's worth of data. Of course, Kamala Harris has only been at the top of the ticket for a small period of this time. But some of the consistencies that we've seen with Donald Trump are remarkable, with a floor of 47% and a ceiling of 49%, consistently for a year, no matter the legal headlines or any of the other noise around this race. He's also continuing to lead on the economy here, Kaylee. That's a sticky number, 5 points on the most important issue in this race.
Yep. Again, 50% say they trust Trump more to handle the economy. Though when you look at the breakdown of economic issues, while Trump is trusted more on things like interest rates and the cost of everyday goods and gas prices, battleground voters do trust Harris more on housing and health care costs, and she has been able to close the gap on taxes. So there have been areas in which she has made gains, but to your point, it's not necessarily enough to overtake Trump on this number one issue.
Sure. When it comes to overall, who do you trust on the economy, and specifically, who do you trust to manage prices? Eli Yoakley has been our partner in this project for the last year, Morning Consult politics analyst, and joins us right now, a year later, with the October numbers. Eli, speak to the consistency, if you would, the stickiness of these numbers for both candidates, specifically, though, for Donald Trump, who seems to have the same exact base now than he did 1 year ago.
Yeah, this race has not moved much. I mean, there's just not that many undecided voters in this contest. I mean, we've been watching this at the national level, and for 11 days, we got the exact same reading every single day on where this election is. I mean, Kamala Harris, in a way that Joe Biden wasn't able to, was able to bring along that 2020 Democratic coalition to match the level of support Donald Trump has with that same group. I mean, the next 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks, is going to be about trying to expand that. I mean, this survey is among likely voters. I think Trump's campaign has been pushing very hard to try to reach out to some of those voters on the fringes who may not think they're likely to vote today. And that's where the battle is going to be over the next 12 days.
Well, and as we consider the messaging over the next 12 days, Eli, I do wonder what the data suggests about what the most effective messaging to win over that very small basket of voters actually will be. When we look at this poll, yes, by wide margins, Harris is found to be more mentally fit by battleground voters, 47 to 33% for Trump. She's seen as more honest by a margin of 10 points. She's seen as compassionate by a margin of 16. Donald Trump, 48% said is dangerous compared to just 35% who said the same for Harris. So as she makes the case here about his unfitness for office, as we mentioned, calling him a fascist yesterday in her town hall on CNN, is that the kind of language that is ultimately going to make the difference? Because all that said about how voters feel about Trump from a personality standpoint, if you will, he's still tied with her across these states.
Yeah. I mean, the dangerous message does meet the electorate where it is. About half of voters in these swing states see Trump as dangerous. And, you know, if you look at the kind of voters who are supporting Kamala Harris's bid, they are less likely than Donald Trump's backers to say their vote is a vote for their candidate. They're more likely to say it's a vote against Trump. And these voters in the middle, the independent voters, the kinds of folks who are more likely to be undecided still, in Kamala Harris's camp, the independent voters supporting Kamala Harris are far more likely to be negatively motivated. And so those kinds of messages seem aimed at that chunk of the electorate. It's policy versus personality. And in the last few weeks, when you're running against Donald Trump, that personality argument carries a lot of weight.
I'm struck by this plurality of swing state voters, likely voters, believe that Kamala Harris will win the election, even though we have a tied number here. This is fascinating to me, Eli, the prospect of a self-fulfilling prophecy. We hear a lot about voters who like to try to pick a winner. Does this advantage Kamala Harris?
It shows energy. I mean, this is one metric of where the momentum is in the campaign, but this number's pretty close too. 45% think she'll win, 41% think Trump will win in the swing states. You know, she has a bit of a energy advantage on this question over Donald Trump, but not by much. I would just point out that this kind of goes against some of the online hand-wringing among the left. Voters in these key states see a lot of energy behind Kamala Harris, and they think she has an advantage, those supporting her, but it's matched by those backing Donald Trump. There's not a lot of people on either side of the aisle who think the other party is going to win.
Well, and as we consider how difficult it's going to be to figure out who wins if the margins is this tight, preparing our audience here on Bloomberg TV and radio for this to take a while to figure out, Eli, it also kind of raises the question as we consider what voters' expectations are of the massive breakdowns we are seeing across demographics, specifically how much more likely it is for women to support Harris and men to support Trump. Can you just walk through the kind of breakdowns across demographics you're looking at, not just by gender, but race as well across these 7 states?
Yeah, I mean, Kamala Harris is doing a very good job among women voters. She's doing well among Black voters. There seems to be a bit of attrition, at least compared to 2020, among the youngest voters. And I think that's what we're kind of seeing Kamala Harris try to lean into in this final couple weeks of the campaign. Campaigning with Beyonce, for example, it seems like outreach to young folks, sending Barack Obama out to talk to young Black men, a group that among all young men is slipping a bit for the Democratic Party, and trying to get folks back where they would be expected to be in this campaign. This last part of this election, though, I mean, I don't want to say the cliche of the election cycle every single year, but it does all come down to turnout here, right? Like, who shows up to vote matters. That's what these last 2 weeks are about in this campaign.
It's never meant more, and as we keep saying, who scores last? Kaylee mentioned Kamala Harris up by 3+ in Michigan. Noteworthy here, Donald Trump's best showing in this poll is in North Carolina, up 1.2%. I take that back. In Georgia, 1.5. But I want to ask you about North Carolina specifically, Eli, because there's been quite a bit that's gone on there to disrupt the flow here, not the least of which has been the scandal surrounding the Republican Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, but also the impact of Hurricane Helene that has caused many people to worry about the very thing you just mentioned, turnout. Could we find ourselves with a very different result in North Carolina because of those factors?
I mean, I think we're seeing folks show up to vote in pretty large numbers in North Carolina already. I think the Mark Robinson issue probably it benefits Democrats to some extent. There's less of a on-the-ground movement for Republicans sort of to try to lift up Donald Trump. But, I mean, we're seeing the Trump campaign put a lot of energy into that state, spending a lot of time there. And, you know, Donald Trump doesn't want to lose North Carolina. Losing North Carolina would make some of these blue wall states matter much less for Kamala Harris. If she was able to pull off a victory down in the South, some of these states like Wisconsin, which is tied, might not matter as much if she can pull off a victory down there. So I think that's why Donald Trump is spending so much energy there.
Well, and as we consider where Trump and Harris are spending their energy tomorrow, Eli, you already mentioned her appearing alongside Beyonce in Houston, but the point of her being in Texas, which is a state that will go for Trump in all likelihood, is to talk about specifically reproductive rights and abortion. This idea of that being something that can resonate nationally, even if she goes to Texas to talk about it. How are we seeing that kind of resonance across these states in the Sun Belt and in the Rust Belt, and as she makes that one of the elements of her closing arguments of this campaign?
Yeah, it matters a lot, especially for women. I mean, we're seeing some sort of a divide among women without children versus women with children in this survey. Clearly, those without children are thinking about this abortion issue in a way that maybe others aren't. You know, Texas is also home to a Senate race that is maybe not the most competitive Senate race historically, if you look at the trends in Texas, but it's a close contest. I mean, Ted Cruz is one of the least popular senators in the country, and his Democratic challenger, Colin Allred, is pulling neck and neck with him down there. And so I think it serves two purposes. One is to help maybe try to boost up the Democratic Senate candidate there, and then to elevate this message about abortion nationally. I mean, you don't have to go somewhere for voters to hear what you're saying in the nature of the online campaign that we're living in. I mean, Donald Trump's going to New York to host a big rally at Madison Square Garden, for example. It seems counterintuitive, but on the other hand, I mean, that stuff can still break through even if he's not in some of these key states.
All right, Eli Yokley, U.S. politics analyst at Morning Consult, our partner on this swing state poll. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us. And Eli talks about that tight Senate race in Texas. Emerson College putting out new polling.
Speaking of one-point races.
One-point race. Cruz, 48%. Colin Allred, 47%. It feels like everything we're looking at is tight.
It's been tightening over the past couple of weeks, which I think is why you're hearing so much agita from both sides here, because I think in many cases they can't believe they aren't breaking out more effectively. The use of just enormous amounts of money, the use of celebrity, and it's the same race that we had weeks ago.
And it's the same race that's being looked at on the Big Take DC podcast this week, which focuses on this poll. And the host is joining us now here in studio, Bloomberg senior Washington correspondent, Saleha Mohsin. So, Saleha, as we look at this poll, and we were just discussing with Eli, this notion that, yes, voters do believe in the swing states that Donald Trump isn't necessarily honest or fit for office, and yet they care about the economy more. Does that signal that Kamala Harris is spending her time talking about the wrong thing in these final days?
Oh, that is quite the question. Maybe she is. I mean, I think our polls did show that when Harris talks about a specific economic policy point, housing or taxes or anything like that, that issue does rise in the poll as something of concern. So people are hearing her. But I think that there is also, let's not discount the Trump era and pre-COVID era nostalgia, that life before COVID was great. We didn't have inflation and all these other problems. We had just gotten these tax cuts, and that's associated with Trump. So there's a lot of that. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that polls see a coin toss, but markets are certain it's going to be Trump.
Yeah.
Although we had a certain whale outed on the poly market here that gives us a sense where that lead may
One
have
guy, 4 accounts in France.
Yeah, kind of like some people thought was happening here. It just speaks to the nation, though, right? Point out the Senate race that you want. Pick the swing state when it comes to presidential. This is a 50-50 country, and we shouldn't be surprised by what we're seeing, should we?
No, I don't think so. It's been contentious since the beginning. This year has been wild. Everyone thought it was the race no one wanted with 2 people that everyone already knew, and then it changed very, very quickly. Each campaign had to start attacking in a very different way. Trump's reaction function had to change. His attack mode had to change. But I think we all need to stop looking at betting markets, at what markets are saying, and maybe even polls, and just wait for the people to turn out and give their say.
Well, and then wait to see what their say actually was for everything to be tabulated. As you talk about the kind of certainty, or at least strong feeling financial markets seem to be presenting that they believe in a Trump victory, whether you're looking at the poly market or the bond market or otherwise. Do you see any sign in the markets right now, Saleha, that they're prepared for the length of time it may take to actually know who won? They don't like uncertainty. We know that.
They don't like uncertainty. I think regardless, they're bracing for election night and week volatility. Bloomberg has had tremendous coverage. We had a story last week about 165 pre-election lawsuits that's already sort of like litigating in courts the election results. And I'm telling you, I'm talking to money managers and investment strategists every day, and they know about all of these things. They're looking at the 2000 Gore versus Bush play as their playbook for when political events become market events. So they're watching, but I don't know how much of that is in the markets.
Yeah. I'm going to put you on the spot with a minutes ago, because I know you love that when you come in to talk to us. We've seen very clear consistency in the scale and size of Donald Trump's base. 47% floor, 49% ceiling in our poll for a year, no matter what this crazy campaign has brought. So the narrative is Donald Trump can't add to his base. Can Kamala Harris add to hers?
She's trying. She's reaching out to black men. She sent Obama out there to scold them publicly. She's reaching out to women, and she's also reaching out to moderate Democrats like Liz Cheney and others, and Republicans, moderate Republicans like Liz Cheney and others who can't stomach Trump. So she's definitely trying, and if she's trying, they must see a window.
Saleha Mosin, of course, the Big Take DC podcast drops today, right?
Yeah.
Apple, Spotify, you figure out the platform. The podcast will be there. Great conversation as always, as we join you on the fastest show in politics with less than 2 weeks to go, and much more on our Bloomberg News swing state poll ahead, along with closing arguments. Tucker Carlson making waves for Donald Trump last night in Georgia. Does it help? We'll have much more ahead right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We got stocks up for the first time this week. Little change right now on the S&P 500 index. We are looking at green. Has been fluctuating between gains and losses. Right now a 12-point advance, up 0.2% as investors sift through a ton of earnings reports. The Dow, though, in the red, down 149 now. Drop there of just about 0.4%. And NASDAQ higher by 117 points, up by about 0.6%. 10-year right around 4.20%. We've got the 2-year 4.04%. Spot gold up $18 the ounce, 27.34, higher by 0.7%. And West Texas Intermediate crude swinging between $70, holding right around there. Right now we're looking at a loss in WTI of 1.1%. Lots of earnings news. IBM shares lower after last night's reports, down now by 6.8%. It did report underwhelming sales as the company grapples with the slowdown in consulting demand. Airline stocks moving lower after earnings. Case in point, American Airlines down now by 1.7%, and Southwest after earnings down by 4.7%. Recapping, S&P 500 index higher right now by 11 points, up 0.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet providing us with the latest look at the markets here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew here in Washington, where with 12 days to go in an election we've spent well over a year and a half talking about, we once again are bringing you the latest on this race in its final stretches. As we have done over the course of this entire cycle, our job here is to bring you the facts as they are, the reality of what these campaigns are doing. Not to sanitize anything, just to present the information as we see it and to get the smart analysis from professionals that provide our audience the context and information they need. It's not always comfortable. Certainly, Joe, we have had to deal with some uncomfortable subjects here on Balance of Power during this cycle, but we present reality as it is, including what went down in Georgia last night when Donald Trump was joined by Tucker Carlson.
How did we wind up with a system where Kamala Harris, you couldn't change the tire on your truck, much less drive it? How did she wind up at the top of the pyramid? If you allow your hormone-addled 15-year-old daughter to like slam the door of her bedroom and give you the finger, you're gonna get more of it. And those kids are gonna wind up in rehab. It's not good for you, and it's not good for them. No. There has to be a point at which dad comes home. And when dad gets home, you know what he says? You've been a bad girl. You've been a bad little girl, and you're getting a vigorous spanking right now. And no, it's not going to hurt me more than it hurts you. No, it's not.
We could keep that going, by the way. It got a lot more pronounced, and repeated references to girls. He of course, has, I believe, children of both gender, but kept referring to how the girl needs a spanking. This got the crowd chanting, "Dad is home," when Donald Trump finally came out. And we want to get a sense, if this is in fact the closing argument for the campaign, what it means for the election. And our political panel is back with us now. Jeannie Shanzano, Democratic analyst, Bloomberg Politics contributor, and political science professor at Iona University, alongside Maura Gillespie, Republican strategist, BlueStack Strategies, a veteran of the John Boehner Speaker's office. Great to see both of you here. Maura, I'll start with you as the Republican. The concerns that Donald Trump has struggled to expand his base and has found himself with a real deficit when it comes to women leads itself to last night's rhetoric in what way?
So if you want to really double down on the fact that you've got a problem with women, what better way than to have Tucker Carlson espouse such a misogynistic, cringy, creepy diatribe there about spanking women? I mean, honestly, it's just, I'm cringing still having heard it again. And Tucker Carlson being one of your final voices in this campaign couldn't be a worse message to send to the country as a whole, because Tucker Carlson takes great pride in having lied to his viewers for years and continues to do so on any platform he gets a chance to use. And I think what's important to remember here is that Donald Trump adores Tucker Carlson because of that reason, because he's able to make money off of lying to the people who trust him. And yet that's going to be somebody that Donald Trump has said that he would bring around him. He could very well get a cabinet position in the White House should Trump win. And so really diving in there and doubling down on your problem with women by having Tucker Carlson speak in this manner, is just, it's disgusting, to be honest. And it's not something that Republicans down ballot should in any way associate with, should really separate themselves from, because it is not something that we should be proud of in any shape or form.
Well, of course, we do have to say here that Tucker Carlson isn't running for president. Donald Trump is, Jeannie, and he may not have tried to distance himself from this language, or we may be able to look back at his being found liable for sexual abuse in the E. Jean Carroll case, back to the Access Hollywood tapes that came out in the 2016 election, yet he won in 2016. Yet we see in our battleground polling again that he still has solid support between 47 and 49%, consistent for the last year. And it raises the question if any of this language actually matters.
It matters. I don't think it matters in terms of moving people away from Donald Trump that have long supported him, and that's why we always talk about his, his ceiling. And the fact is that this is language that people like Tucker Carlson and people on the Trump side believe is going to be useful for them in driving out the vote with the young men and men who are very hard to get out to vote in the same numbers as women. So it's gotten them enormous amounts of attention in the last 24 hours. And so that's the context in which they're doing it. They too see the gender divide that the Bloomberg Morning Council poll and all the other poll shows. And I would just also say that, Tucker Carlson was saying this in the context of doling out punishment to Democrats and members of the media. And this is a theme that's been running through Donald Trump's campaign: retribution against those who are opposed to him, revenge. And that is what we are hearing and seeing. And Kaylee, I have to add, you missed Joe Matthews' rendition of it earlier on the previous hours.
Oh, God.
That was something to behold. And Maura and I sat through that.
I feel like I should
endured
regret that and apologize for it. But look, there are questions about, and I'm not seeking equivalencies here, there are questions about the effectiveness of both campaigns' closing arguments. Kamala Harris is talking about fascism last night in her CNN town hall, following, of course, the revelations from General John Kelly in two separate interviews yesterday. Let's go back to the town hall on CNN last evening. Here's the vice president.
General Milley calling Donald Trump a fascist. You yourself have not used that word to describe him. Let me ask you tonight, do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I also believe that the people who know him best on this subject should be trusted.
Jeannie, Kamala Harris is down 5 points in our new Bloomberg News swing state poll out today when it comes to the economy. Is that what she has to train her attention on, as opposed to going back to what was a Joe Biden refrain, that Donald Trump is a fascist and a threat to democracy?
She should be talking about the economy, but the numbers that they're looking at in the campaign are numbers which show for this very small sliver of moderates who are still labeling themselves as undecided. It is this argument that moved them by 14% in some of this internal polling. And that is the argument that we can't trust Donald Trump. He is unfit to serve. And in fact, most effective, not from Kamala Harris, but people like John Kelly, people like Liz Cheney. That's why we just saw, I think, a $370 million ad buy on the part of the Harris campaign for the swing states, focusing on this very issue. So while the economy is number one in most people's mind, we're in such a close race that they practically need to be going to people's doors and walking them to the polls. And these people they're trying to reach who aren't voting early and haven't decided, these are the people who they think they can move. And so it's that argument, and it's reproductive health 1 and 2 with those folks.
Well, and we know reproductive health is what Harris will be focusing on when she is in Texas tomorrow with Beyonce in Houston, focusing on abortion. At this time, though, she is still in Pennsylvania. She's taking questions from the press right now. We'll, of course, bring you any news from her if we get it. Maura, as we consider what Jeannie was just talking about, this idea that she's trying to bring moderate Republicans onto her side, you probably would classify in that camp. And I just wonder if the job she's doing may be effective at convincing those people not to vote for Trump, but not necessarily to go out and vote for her. Isn't there a difference there? Is she doing a good enough job of trying to convince people why she should get their vote?
There is a difference, but there's only so much that she can do. She can't really, I think as a candidate who's running for the office who wants to win this election, she should try to get those voters to vote for her. I, as a moderate Republican, am happy to say to my fellow Republicans, you don't have to vote for Donald Trump to stay a Republican. You can vote down ballot. And I think that message of why he is unfit to serve and why it's so important not to vote for him for president, I'm not telling anyone they have to go vote for Kamala Harris because maybe they don't feel strongly enough to go do that. Maybe they don't feel as though they trust her entirely either. But there's a write-in option. But simply, too, with some of these Republicans, by not voting for Donald Trump, there is a net benefit. Because if we want to have a government that works across the aisle, that finds common ground to get things done, then I think the best case scenario of doing that is by making sure the House is led by Speaker Mike Johnson, making sure the Senate is led by John Thune, and moving the ball forward by working together towards where more things are in the middle. I think most of the country is. And I think that by pointing out that Trump has time and time again shown us that he is not only unfit to serve mentally, physically, but he just is not there. Again, he's about 80 years old. And if you had complaints and concerns about Joe Biden being too old for this job, then you cannot sit there and say that Donald Trump is, raring to go when that's just not the case. And these comments, these, adoration for dictators, all the things that Kamala Harris is pointing out is helpful. And I do think it is effective because it's a reminder of what could potentially be entering the White House again in just a matter of months.
Jeannie, Fox News is reporting now that the Trump campaign has settled on its closing argument, its closing mantra. You can fit it on a bumper sticker. Harris broke it, Trump will fix it. Effective?
Yeah, I think that is effective because, what is it they need to do? It's the same thing Kamala Harris is doing. He needs to focus attention on Kamala Harris, tie her to Joe Biden and say, you broke the economy. Look at the inflation. Look at costs of housing. Look at everything like that, energy. You don't want to redo this again. She can't even get up in that town hall and say what she would do differently. So you should have me come back and fix it. That's a good closing message for him. But I am very suspicious he will be disciplined enough to stick to it. And by the way, it's the same thing that Kamala Harris is doing. He's unfit. He's going to take away your freedom to choose and your freedom to have the health care you and your doctor think is best. And so you should stick with the safe choice as with me. And that's because we have people that are trying to now get people out to vote, and nothing gets people out to vote like these kinds of negative messages scaring people about what's to come if their opponent wins.
All right, Jeannie Shanzano, Democratic strategist and Bloomberg Politics contributor, alongside Maura Gillespie, a Republican strategist at Blue Stack Strategies. Thank you both for joining us on this Thursday edition of Balance of Power. And we still have more ahead. We'll speak with former Obama campaign manager Jim Messina straight ahead on these closing arguments in these final days of the campaign. That's next on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks are trading mixed right now. We've got the S&P higher, up 12. That is a gain of 0.2%. Traders sifting through all those earnings reports. The Dow down 126, down 0.3%. Nasdaq holding on to a gain right now of just about 0.7%. 10-year at 4.18% with a 2-year 4.04%. Gold up 0.8%, 27.36 the ounce, and a retreat for crude right around $70 a barrel, lower now by 1%. After earnings, Tesla ripping higher, up now by 20.6%. Also after earnings, United Parcel Service up by 4.9%, and rival FedEx Corp up by 1.7%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you. As always, watching Wall Street for us here on the fastest show in politics. I am Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines. With 12 days to go here until the election, coming off of what was supposed to be the final presidential debate. Wouldn't that have been something last night to have Donald Trump and Kamala Harris on a stage together? Donald Trump did not agree to the debate or the venue, which was CNN, so it became a town hall and another free hour of airtime, in this case, for Kamala Harris. They talked about a lot, but as we consider the closing arguments from both candidates, we spoke earlier about Tucker Carlson last evening, Daddy's home in Georgia. That was happening while Kamala Harris was crystallizing her closing argument, coming off of the rhetoric that we heard yesterday about Donald Trump as a fascist, remembering that General John Kelly did a couple of interviews to that extent, talking about Trump as a threat to democracy. She was asked about it by Anderson Cooper. Let's listen.
General Milley calling Donald Trump a fascist. You yourself have not used that word to describe him. Let me ask you tonight, do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I also believe that the people who know him best on this subject should be trusted.
So for more on this element of Harris's closing argument in a race that our new Bloomberg Morning Consult polling in the battleground states is literally a dead heat, we turn to Jim Messina. He is chairman of the Democracy Defenders PAC, also founder and CEO of the Messina Group, and of course was a campaign manager for Barack Obama. He is in our New York headquarters. Jim, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. We've seen Kamala Harris leaning more and more on this messaging that Trump is unfit to serve, a fascist, as she said she agreed could be described of him that way last night, that he is a danger to democracy. Frankly, she's sounding a lot like Joe Biden. Is that a mistake?
No, I think she crystallized her closing message last night when she said Donald Trump has an enemies list and I have a to-do list for the American people. And that's going to be the contrast. When I ran President Obama's campaign, Kaylee, I used to say to him, we need it to be a very clear choice. And that's the choice that she is attempting to drive here in the final days of this election.
Jim, it's good to see you at World Headquarters in New York. Thanks again for joining us. That is an interesting and crystallized campaign message. The Trump campaign has an answer. Kamala Harris broke it. Trump will fix it. You, as a practitioner here, I know you're wearing your Democratic hat, can say what about both? Contrast these two closing arguments for us.
Well, look, I think both of them are attempting to figure out the theory of the case of this election. And what you realize is these swing voters, Joe, that you and I and Kaylee have talked about so many times before, think about politics 4 minutes a week. They have an average of 2.5 jobs. They're busy and have their life in front of them. And it really is about them. It's not about politicians. It's not about what they want. It is about what these voters want, and they want a better life. And the candidate who taps into that in these final days is going to win this election.
Well, when we consider what a better life means, perhaps that also means better opportunities or better situations economically. At least that's what our polling suggests. The economy is still the #1 issue, and across the battleground states, Donald Trump is still trusted more on it. They've both outlined their economic plans, but is he spending or is she spending enough time talking about hers and the contrast between them? Would that be a better way to spend the next 12 days?
Well, I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You have to do both. And in your morning consult poll, I think the number that really stood out to me is they're basically tied on taxes, and they're now tied on who's looking out for you. And that's a key metric, because you're right. He has this advantage on the economy that is kind of stabilizing his campaign. If she can get even with him, if she can start to catch up, and there's some evidence in the battleground states that it's closing, then she'll be really well off. But if he wins this election, it's because he'll win on the economy.
What do you make of the use of celebrity here in the next couple of days and the week or so? Jim Messina, you know a lot about this. I was at your convention. You had the Foo Fighters on stage. You had Mary J. Blige. This is Bruce Springsteen. We're adding Beyonce to the list here. Does it start to cloud the message? I remember Rick Davis's ad, the McCain campaign, running the celebrity ad against Barack Obama in the first campaign. He obviously still won, but there is a point of diminishing returns here, is there not?
I don't think so, Joe, and here's why. I think what we all can agree on is the American public is over this election and kind of sick of the candidates and the negative ads. And
So may as well have a concert.
Well, bringing some celebrities into it shows you in a different light. Having Beyonce show up is helpful. It'll turn people out. You know, Trump's looking for his stuff. Eminem introduced Barack Obama the other night. Two things I never thought we'd say together. But the truth is that in the waning days, you want to continue to make it exciting. You want to show momentum. And I think celebrity really plays into that.
Well, as we consider the other people that are factors in this race beyond the candidates for president themselves, there's obviously their surrogates. There's also other people who are running in these states at the same time they are, including in Senate races. And when you look at the latest data out of some of these Senate polls in the swing states, Tammy Baldwin in a tie in Wisconsin, Bob Casey in a toss-up, according to Cook Political Report, in Pennsylvania. When you look at that kind of data, Jim, about how tight these other races are in these states, what does it make you think about the presidential campaign?
That it's tied as well. Pretty much, you know, in these battleground presidential states, the Senate races tend to kind of rise and fall with the presidential campaign, with the exception of Nevada, which seems to have its own sort of difference, where the Democrat in the Senate is pulling away, whereas Harris is struggling in Nevada. In the other states, you know, the Democrat is performing pretty near Harris, and it's a reminder that people are much more ticket voting than they used to be. There used to be these mythical swing voters, and there's just not anymore. And it's why both sides want their presidential campaign to overperform.
Well, Jim, we've got 12 days, as we've mentioned.
Thank God,
What would be
Joe.
your advice? Yeah, well, I don't. That still feels a little long to me, to be honest. Kamala Harris is going to be on the ellipse on Tuesday, talking about threats to democracy, trying to conjure the images, and she'll be able to do that with the optics there, but also the emotions, the feelings of January 6th. That could be a lasting tone that she sets here in what will be the final week of the campaign. What would be your advice to her and the campaign at large as they deal with the potency of January 6th?
I would be careful not to overplay it. I wouldn't make it all doom and gloom. It needs to be a contrast, and a contrast to that moment, January 6th, with the violence and the anger. You know, allow a little bit of hope, allow a little bit of, this is us, this is our side, we're different, we will bring stability. But I think to your point, Joe, it is an incredibly important moment. She's only been in this race 92 days, and there still is this thing called the commander-in-chief test. Voters want to see her be presidential, and I think it's a brilliant move to go there, and now she needs to deliver a strong performance, look at the country and say, hey, watch me, I can be your leader, I can do this job. And I think it's a very smart move, but it's a very high stakes move as well, and it'll come just days before the election.
It's Jim Messina. He's chair of Democracy Defenders PAC, founder, CEO of the Messina Group, former Obama campaign manager. Give our regards when you walk through the pantry, Jim. It's great to have you at World Headquarters in New York. As we consider this important moment now in the campaign, we add another voice. Peter Wunsch Live from the IMF meetings here in Washington, D.C., and Governor of the National Bank of Belgium, European Central Bank Governing Council member, with a very different point of view on things. Mr. Wunsch, welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio, and thank you for joining us from the IMF. We're only a couple of days out, as we've been mentioning here, 12 days from the U.S. election taking place. Is that the main topic of conversation where you are?
It is certainly an important topic of conversation, and we, of course, look a lot at what's taking place in the U.S. At the same time, we've had discussions more specifically on, inflation and where the European economy is going. But the two might be related going forward.
Well, and as we look going forward, we have a central bank decision here in the U.S. just 2 days after the election. You yourself and your colleagues at the ECB will have one coming up as well. The market thinks in December there is a rate cut baked in, that there is a chance for a half-point move. Can you rule out 50 basis points? What would you need to see to make a cut of that size?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's a question I've been getting a lot recently. I don't think really that's the discussion today. I know some of my colleagues are already discussing cutting 50 basis points in December. We'll have 2 more readings of inflation before we have new projections. My take on it is, of course, the European economy is weaker than we thought, and we had an inflation surprise on the downside in September. But I think, honestly, talking about a 50 basis point cut in December is premature. We are data dependent, so I really want to see the data. We don't know as of yet whether this weak number on inflation in September is a blip. We had a forecast with basically inflation going back to around 2.5 at the end of the year. It might be lower, and it might mean that we have to remove restriction faster. But I don't see why we should today have a discussion on a 50 basis point cut in December. I think really it's premature.
Governor Wunsch, I wonder the extent to which geopolitical risk is clouding your ability to forecast. We talk about, of course, the war in Ukraine here every day, also an escalating conflict throughout the Middle East. Is geopolitical risk a greater level of uncertainty than the U.S. election?
Well, I think it's a combination of the two, of course. Depending on who's going to win the election in the U.S., you might have discussions about tariffs, which could impact the world economy and the European economy. We had at some point some tensions on the oil prices, and then it abated. It could go up again. So, of course, that's part of the reason why it's a difficult environment to navigate. But also, more broadly speaking, I mean, I've said before, what we have under control is not under control, and what we don't have under control is under control, by which I mean domestic inflation in Europe is still very high, and it's because imported inflation is low that we see inflation going on average towards 2%. But it also means that you still have tensions on both directions. So you have imported inflation below target, you have domestic inflation above target, and a few changes here and there on oil prices, on tariff, can make it move in one or the other direction. And indeed, the number we got in September was more in the direction of lower inflation, but we still need more information to be sure that we are landing to this target.
So you've told us 2 things, Governor, that the European economy is weaker than you thought, but that domestic inflation also is still very high. When we look at the picture holistically, and not just how monetary policy factors in, but fiscal policy as well, which in many European countries is tightening, do you see forces at work in which there could be a further weakening of the domestic European economies, and then potentially an undershoot of inflation?
I think the risks are still relatively balanced, and with the number we've had in September and also the PNI, maybe they've been moving a little bit more on the downside. But I would not over-dramatize inflation falling to 1.8% or 1.7%, honestly. We've been way above 2% for a while. And to the extent that it would be imported inflation, which is low, that's a completely different scenario than inflation, domestic inflation being close to or below target, which is not the case today. So again, it's part of the picture. It's part of what we are going to look at when deciding on further cuts. I guess directionally, we can start removing and maybe even accelerate removing the restrictive monetary policy we had. but I would not make a bet in terms of the speed at which we will get there as of now.
All right, Governor, we appreciate you joining us today on Bloomberg Live from the IMF World Bank meetings here in Washington, D.C. That was Pierre Wunsch, Governor of the National Bank of Belgium and member of the Governing Council of the European Central Bank. We appreciate your time, sir, as we have an eye abroad and at home, and how many of these issues, Joe, intersect as we talk about the economic picture around the world. Monetary policymakers, fiscal policymakers, rather, having to factor in a U.S. election, which could have major implications for inflation, for growth, and relationships between the U.S. and other countries around the world.
It's a cloudy crystal ball, but we'll continue having this conversation on the late edition of Balance of Power. We'll meet you at 5 p.m. Eastern here on Bloomberg.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, live on radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg Business Week for this Thursday, October 24th.
Back.
I'm back, better than ever.
It's good to have you back. We missed you.
I got to tell you, the cold season, the flu season, man, it's off and running.
I feel like you're
be careful.
110%, though. I do.
Maybe
there.
more like 87,
Okay.
but we're getting there. All right, everybody. Speaking what is getting there, the Bulls back in charge because you've got stocks up for the first time, Tim, this week.
Yeah, we're 11 days away from the U.S. election counted. Also on our mind today, Carol, one stock that is just leading the way higher. Yeah, Tesla, it's soaring on that upbeat outlook.
Yeah, we're going to walk through the quarter, the outlook, what it all means. Meantime, not doing so well is Boeing. That stock slipping on a strike setback. So we're going to take a look at why Boeing needs to end that strike now.
Also, as we said, under 2 weeks out from the election, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, they are locked in a dead heat. We got the latest numbers from the final Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll ahead of the 2024 presidential election.
Close.
I think razor thin is exactly how our team described it.
Oh my gosh. And also on that, we've got the details on the Trump whale spending millions on a Trump win. It is a story, safe to say, that I think for about the last week or two, we've all been a little obsessed with.
That more coming up over the next hour. First up, though, a check on the day's trade and top business stories. Here's Charlie.
All right, I thank you very much, Tim and Carol. Welcome back, Carol. Tesla ripping higher right now. We'll have more in a moment, but right now up by 20.7%. Stocks higher for the first time this week. Traders sifting through all those corporate earnings reports for clues about the health of the U.S. economy. S&P up 4 right now, a gain of 0.1%. The Dow up down 205, a decline there of 0.5%. Nasdaq up 94, up by about 0.5%. 10-year 4.18%, the 2-year 4.04%. Gold, spot gold up $19 the ounce, $27.34, up by about 0.7%. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.9%, $70.12 for a barrel of WTI. Tesla is surging after the carmaker reported surprisingly strong earnings and forecasts as much as 30% growth in vehicle sales next year. It's a topic we'll have a whole lot more on coming up right here on Bloomberg Business Week. The latest on McDonald's, we've got Yum Brands now removing fresh onions at some of its Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, and KFC locations as the restaurant industry contends with an E. coli outbreak early in the week. McDonald's, right now we got McDonald's shares trading higher by 1.1%. Yum Brands is lower. Yum Brands down by 0.6%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Got it, Charlie. Thank you so much. That is your setup on this Thursday with just about 2 hours to go until the closing bell. We are watching Tesla. Charlie talked about it. We talked about it. The stock surging the most, I should say, in more than 3.5 years. The car maker reported surprisingly strong earnings, gave a juiced up forecast for growth in vehicle sales next year. Tesla CEO Elon Musk highlighted it all on last night's earnings call.
I do want to give some rough estimate, which is I think it's 20 to 30% vehicle growth next year. Notwithstanding negative external events.
All right, so an upbeat outlook, some caveats, if you will. That was Elon Musk on last night's earnings call. Keep in mind, while the stock is soaring today, as we said, it's up about 20%. It is still 37% lower from its high back in November of 2021.
With more on how Tesla is doing with us, we've got a Bloomberg News Global Autos editor, Craig Trudell, joining us from London. Craig, before the call last night at 5:30 New York time, Tesla shares were up just about 8%. What specifically did investors hear on the call that caused shares to move higher in today's trade?
I mean, Musk was in sort of rare form. I think, you often can sort of can count on him being quite positive. And, sometimes he gives people reasons to bid the stock up. Other times, he's less careful. I think last night he wasn't necessarily careful. He at one point said something about, I'm going to take a risk and offer, this upbeat outlook for next year. As we heard in the clip that you just played, I mean, he also, sort of couched this. Later on, he talked about, his forecast for how many cyber cabs they'll make, a couple years out as just his best guesses. So that being said, there was a lot to like about this quarter in terms of, sort of the breadth of what went well. I think expectations were quite low in terms of what revenue and earnings were going to be. And they beat expectations on a lot of metrics, and it was kind of widespread. It wasn't just the car business. They're doing well on the energy side as well.
Well, that's what I wondered, Craig, is this a report where we were all managed so well going into it and had very low expectations? And so when Tesla comes in stronger than forecast and above those low expectations, we were all just like, whoa, really surprised? Or is this a report where Tesla, the business, is actually doing well?
I think it's a little bit of all the above. I mean, is it a 21% move up in the shares sort of report? I'm shocked by this, but what do I know? I'm just a journalist, so I think it is the case that the stock has gotten roughed up a little bit the last couple of weeks since the robo-taxi unveiling. I think there was really high expectations going into that because Musk had sort of spent months hyping up all the work that they've done on AI and years now on self-driving. And we don't actually have, necessarily clear indications that, some of the promises he's made or predictions that he's made are close. You don't have to look very far to see, people who use the product that the company calls full self-driving, acting up, not working so well. They recognized some revenue this past quarter from deferred revenue related to that business. And, one of the features that they rolled out, actually Smart Summon, which is an interesting acronym, we're seeing reports of people trying to summon their cars in parking lots and getting into scrapes. And so, there's still, a lot left to be said about, just how much longer this company, needs to work on this technology to get it to where it's safe.
Hey, Craig, there were a lot of questions ahead of the earnings call yesterday about whether or not analysts would ask any questions related to Elon Musk's political activities, the $75 million he's given to the America PAC in support of former President Donald Trump during this election cycle. What did we hear from Musk on the call about a potential second Trump administration? How did he weigh in on politics?
Yeah, it was interesting. I think, Tesla solicits investor questions, going into these calls, and there were a lot of questions submitted having to do with politics and investors wanting to, hear Musk address, his support for Trump and just how outspoken he's been. He didn't utter Trump's name once, which was a little surprising to me, but he did allude to this idea of, maybe if he were to be appointed the head of the government efficiency department that he and Trump talked about on X a while back, maybe he would work on national rules for getting robo-taxis on the road. So he sort of gave investors a little bit of a taste of how he would, potentially be able to tip the scales after becoming such a huge benefactor of Donald Trump.
Investors who wanted something today got better than expected profit and guidance for growth on deliveries. That was from Gene Munster over at Deepwater Asset Management. He said the long-term investors got the golden carrot. So is it the golden carrot on the delivery numbers? Is that what it is?
I think that was a big one. I mean, there's I think real legitimate concern as to whether or not the company will deliver more cars this year than it did last year. Through the first 3 quarters of the year, that deliveries are down, and they're going to need a real substantial jump in the fourth quarter to get to where they're positive. I think the company surprised people by saying they do expect some slight growth for this year, so they're really going to have to finish strong. And then 20 to 30%, I think, that sounds great. I didn't necessarily get, a strong sense of how exactly this company is going to pull that off because they have not specified what sort of product is coming that could possibly, pace that.
What about the more affordable car that was promised in what was the first half of 2025?
Didn't he kind of say something about that?
He's alluded generally to new vehicles, including more affordable models, but what those models are, we have no idea. it's not going to be a $25,000 Tesla with a steering wheel and pedals, because he was very dismissive of a question posed about that. So I think it's pretty clear at this point they're going to refresh the Model Y and maybe offer some cheaper versions of the Model Y and the Model 3, and are counting on getting growth going again.
And we know, Carol, that steering wheels and pedals are not the future for Tesla.
So I hear. I'm thinking it's a cheaper Cybertruck. Like maybe you get a discounted version. I don't know.
That's definitely coming too. It's got to. Yeah.
Good stuff. Craig Trudell, thank you so much. Global Autos editor at Bloomberg News, joining us from our bureau in London. All right, that's a stock that we mentioned is soaring. It is, I think, the #1 gainer in the NASDAQ 100, also top gainer in the S&P. Let's get now to a decliner.
Yeah, shares of Boeing have slipped as much as 3.2% today. This after factory workers rejected a new labor contract that would have increased their wages by 35% over 4 years. Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg's quest to stabilize the plane maker that's been struggling suffered a stinging setback. This after factory workers rejected that new labor contract. Some 64% of the union members who cast ballots Wednesday, Carol, voted against the tentative agreement. That's according to the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers District. They represent 33,000 striking workers.
All right, so we laid it out for you. Let's get an update on Boeing and why our next guest says Boeing needs to settle this strike now. He is Thomas Black, Bloomberg Opinion, manufacturing, logistics, and aerospace columnist. He joins us from our Dallas bureau. Boeing shares, by the way, are down 40% year to date. All right, Thomas, first up, step back. Remind us the terms of this contract, why the workers were striking, why it was rejected, why Boeing might not give it more.
Workers are clearly angry, and they've been saving up for this. I think they really feel burned by the contract that they signed 10 years ago, and they've been waiting for this moment. So we see now that they're really entrenched. The offer was pretty rich, 35% salary increase over 4 years, and there's a 100% match in the 401k pension, and there's some signing bonuses and so forth. But they want more, and there's some talk that they want to reinstate the defined benefit pension plan. I'm not sure, that might be a stretch, but we'll see. They certainly have the upper hand right now.
Well, yeah, you say they have the upper hand, so just give us an idea of the leverage that they have right now. You got a new CEO coming in. Labor issues are only part of the challenge that Kelly Ortberg has to figure out. There are the manufacturing issues. There's the issues with the delays. There's certainly the safety issues, the concerns for its customers, including American Airlines, Southwest, and the like. What kind of leverage do the workers have right now?
Unfortunately, they got all the leverage because Boeing is also burning cash, right? Its investment grade rating is at stake. It can't really move any of these pieces forward on raising financing to get it through this difficult period, restarting manufacturing, instituting a change in the culture at the factory floor until they get this resolved. So nothing can move forward until they finally get their workers back in the factory. So it's a pretty difficult situation.
Well, and it's right about Boeing for Boeing's balance sheet, like to kind of figure this out and move forward. But it's also that big supply chain, right, that Boeing plays into. That has an impact as well.
Yes, Boeing doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? It's an ecosystem, and suppliers are waiting for the starting gun to go off. But right now, it seems to be jammed up, right? So, and there's a difference. There's large suppliers who are okay. They can increase some inventories. They might even furlough some workers. It's the small ones that really are in a tight squeeze because it's hard for them to stop production and then restart. So you start to do damage to the supply chain. And those small suppliers, like Kelly Ortberg said, every part needs to be on the plane, right? So if they're making small parts or low volume specialized parts, those folks count. And this is where the damage to the supply system is only going to increase as we go along.
What do we know about pressure that Boeing is getting from, be it their suppliers, but also I'm thinking about the CEO of American Airlines went on CNBC and he said he looks forward to the day when Boeing is not a distraction. That's a quote, highlighting the growing frustration among the plane makers' biggest customers. He says, we've been struggling with them over the last 5 years. noting that that American can deliver the capacity as planned for the remainder of this year, but that he worries about promised Boeing plane deliveries in the future. I mean, I do think about that order book. It's long. We've talked about this, and this is why most major carriers only have two choices, Airbus or Boeing. And yet the longer this goes on, I wonder about, how much more risk is piled on to Boeing's plate.
Yeah, the airlines are in a difficult situation because they can't plan effectively because they're not sure they're going to get those new planes. And it also costs them money. They have to keep these older planes flying, and that means more maintenance costs. So they're in a difficult situation. They were instrumental in bringing the new CEO on board, Kelly Ortberg. So they're kind of stuck with, they have the guy in place. They just really need to get things going. And again, nothing is going to start until they can put this strike to bed and get workers back on the factory floor. That's why they've got to get it done. I'm not here to, I obviously don't know the intricacies of the discussions, but it seems like Boeing is going to have to sweeten the offer again.
There were some folks who were thinking that this would be the time that Boeing would be able to get this resolved, that those workers would be going back to work over the next month after reaching an agreement yesterday. That obviously didn't happen. We don't know the intricacies of the discussions that are going on, but if you're an investor in this company, if you're trying to understand when these workers are going to go back, what's a realistic timeline that you should be thinking about?
Well, even if they resolve the strike today, it's going to take time to ramp up production. Kelly Ortberg said it will take them 2 weeks just to get folks back into the factory. They're going to have to retrain some workers. So even if they resolve this now, it's still going to take a while to crank up production. And again, the longer this goes on, the more pressure it puts on suppliers. It'll drag that timeline out. Some suppliers are doing okay. You have GE, which has an aftermarket service business. That's actually doing very well because they have to maintain the older planes longer. So some suppliers are going to get through this okay, but again, it's the smaller ones that really can be a problem within the supply chain.
Hey, Thomas, to be fair, it's an opinion column. You're putting it out there, and you're basically saying Boeing has to end the strike right now. Your point is, if they don't, then what? Fill in that sentence for me.
The financial pressure is going to build. Customers are going to get angrier. Suppliers are going to hurt more. There's pressure everywhere.
And the U.S. government will fill in the blank.
They're going to hopefully come in and help. Again, we saw the acting labor secretary play a role in this last offer. Maybe they can help break the logjam, but it's not really clear what the workers want. Again, they've talked about reinstating this defined benefit pension plan. I'm not sure that's going to happen. I don't think there is a case of that happening where a plan has been canceled or mothballed and then it's brought back to life. We'll see. It seems a lot of people talk about those types of plans as a relic of the past, that companies really suffered when you go through a downturn and you still have to pay all those commitments.
Right.
So I'm not sure that's going to happen.
Like an overhead, a legacy cost, right? That we've heard that a lot. Companies have really turned away from that. Thomas Black, thank you always. Manufacturing, logistics, and aerospace columnist at Bloomberg Opinion, Inner Dallas Bureau. Well, the clock ticking up again on a Boeing strike, but it's ticking down on a U.S. election. And that's where we go. It is this close. We're going to get to that. That's next.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We are looking at a mixed day. We've got the Dow Jones Industrial Average lower, the S&P, NASDAQ. They are both advancing right now. Traders sifting through a slew of corporate earnings for clues about the health of the U.S. economy. Tesla shares, they're up 21%. S&P up 12, gained 0.2%. The Dow slumping 137, down 0.3%. NASDAQ up 128, up by about 0.7%. 10-year yield 4.18% with a 2-year 4.05%. Gold is up 0.8%. Spot gold now at $27.37 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 1%, $70.03 for a barrel of WTI. Apple is planning a week of announcements relating to the Mac computer lineup. That, according to marketing executive Greg Joswiak. He did not specify what products Apple will be unveiling, but Bloomberg News has reported the rollout will include the first Macs with M4 processors. Apple shares today lower, little change, down 0.1%. Again, recapping here, stocks are trading mixed. The S&P holding on to a gain right now of 13 points, up by about 0.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Well, both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris have graced the cover of Bloomberg Business Week magazine. We bring that up because if you want to check out those stories or never want to miss a Bloomberg Business Week story, you can get unlimited access to Business Week and unlock deep reporting and analysis from reporters around the globe. To do so and become a subscriber, all you have to do is head to Bloomberg.com/subscribe. All right, as for the race, yep, folks, it is less than 2 weeks away. And Tim, talk about razor-thin margins.
Yeah, the contest between Trump and Harris could hardly be tighter. The candidates statistically tied among likely voters in each of the 7 swing states in the Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll. Get ready, everyone, for the final blitz of advertising, rallies, door-knocking campaigns that could decide who claims the White House. Depending on where you live, your door might be knocked on, or if you live in a state like New York or California,
what do
you
they
may
do?
just be completely
Do they
forgotten
slide
about.
it under the door?
No, they don't do anything because, you know, different states matter. These are not the swing states.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
With the latest on our poll, Bloomberg News politics editor Laura Davison, she joins us from our Washington, D.C. bureau. Laura, good to have you here. We've been doing these for about a year or so. Remind us who was surveyed, when it was done, what was asked.
Yeah, so this was a poll of all 7 swing states. So that's those blue wall states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, as well as some of the southern states we call the Sun Belt states. This is Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada. These are where the battleground for the presidential election is. And what this poll showed is that it is essentially a dead heat in all of those states. In a couple, Trump has an edge, Harris has an edge in some, but it's all within the margin of error, which means that this is really anybody's race to win. We asked both, who do people think, who do they want to vote for, who do they think will win? Interesting that Harris had a slight edge in that, regardless of who people supported themselves. And we also asked a lot of questions.
Wait, slow
about
down
the
for a
economy.
second. So you ask ultimately who is going to win, right? And you said, more said Harris.
But yes, so we asked people, who do you want to win? Who are you going to vote for? And then we also asked them, regardless of who you support, who do you think will win? And Harris had a slight edge in that question.
How do you explain that?
A part of this may be a little bit of a lagging indicator that she has had a lot of momentum, coming out of the summer into the fall. But some of that has slowed. We've seen, our poll really tighten here in the last several weeks. It may also be, depending what these voters are seeing and hearing. Harris has been on the airwaves in these states a lot more than Trump has. He's starting to spend more. He's doing more time on the campaign trail. But, we didn't ask further down, why specifically. But these may be some of the indicators that are pushing people to say that they think Harris has the edge.
Before we get into the particulars, is there anything that's notable or tends to trend in terms of presidential polling as it gets closer and closer to the actual day of voting? Do polls tend to get tighter? I mean, I'm just curious about historically what we have seen.
Yeah, so traditionally polls do tend to get a little bit tighter just because more people are tuning in, more people are starting to make decisions. So some of those undecided voters in the middle, are breaking to one side or another. Also worth noting is that this poll is of likely voters, people that we have determined we think are, likely to show up. Previously back, several months ago, and, we started this poll last October, we were polling registered voters. So that can also shift a little bit just as we make some decisions about who do we think is actually going to show up and vote on November 5th or early, in fact.
Also, some interesting details about how these respondents are labeling the different candidates. Talk to us a little bit about what you found in terms of the words that people associate with Trump versus Harris.
Yeah, so this is, really interesting. We asked, is people too old, too dangerous? Whether, they would be a strong leader, a compassionate leader, cares about people like me. Harris came out ahead in every one of those categories, except for when was asked about a strong leader. So that's one thing that, Trump has the edge in, and, clearly perhaps an issue that people care about more. We look at this as a dead heat poll. People on all these character issues say that Harris, has the edge, but they still want Trump largely on policy issues.
What about those double haters, which we talked about so much a few weeks ago, I feel like, or a few months ago? Where are they?
Those double haters have not completely disappeared, but they are, not the force in the electorate that they once were. We used to have a lot of people who said they didn't want either Trump nor Biden. Some of those folks early on were looking at RFK Jr. and other third-party candidates. That whole factor has really disappeared, and this is really sort of a two-party, two-person race at this point.
What do people consider still the most important issue when it comes to voting, and how has that shifted throughout the year we've been doing this survey?
Tim, it's the economy, stupid.
You stole my line, but yes, it's been the economy.
It's a rhetorical question, too.
All throughout. Though there's sort of the second place question, has sort of been this, this group of three: immigration, democracy, and abortion. Those, have kind of, been fighting for second place throughout the campaign. Immigration has sort of been the strongest of those. We've really seen Republicans in particular lean into that issue. Trump talks about that on the campaign trail all the time. And when you look at the party crosstabs breaking down, that is an issue much more so for Republicans than for Democrats.
I do wonder, too, what has changed in terms of polling and the trends since Joe Biden stepped away and Kamala Harris stepped up. Is she polling better than he was in our earlier polls?
Yes, she, is polling better than Biden did, really throughout, Biden's time in the race. We saw an immediate jump, and she's been able to sustain that, though Trump has kind of picked up some of those undecided and voters in the interim. What's noteworthy also is that she is polling much better on economic policy issues. Biden was really behind Trump on most of these issues, looking at taxes and, inflation, prices, housing, all of these things. Harris has, been able to catch up with Trump and in some cases surpass him. And she's been talking about, her plans to reduce prices for families, her tax plan, all of these things out on the campaign trail. The issues like housing that she's hit really hard, she's actually now more popular and has more trust among voters than Trump does.
It's interesting. I mean, the taxes, interest rates, housing costs, the economy, cost of everyday goods, they're kind of split, Carol, when it comes to who thinks who would actually be favorable.
Which just talks about why maybe we're so close when it comes to all of this. Just fascinating stuff. Hey, listen, Laura, we're going to leave it there. Amazing that we're under 2 weeks to go until voting. And as we know, early voting has begun in a lot of states. Laura Davison, she's Bloomberg News politics editor, joining us there from D.C. As we mentioned, you can read all about the poll. Just head to Bloomberg.com or check it out on the Bloomberg. Right now, we want to head to Washington, D.C., where the 2024 fall meetings of the World Bank Group and the IMF are underway, and to where Bloomberg TV's surveillance co-host Lisa Abramowitz is sitting down with the IMF Deputy Managing Director Gita Gopinath. Let's head to her now. Lisa.
Hey, how's it going, Carol? I am here indeed with Gita Gopinath, the first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, at a time where it feels like people are girding for change. And you talk about some of this in your recent outlook. You say that there is a great deal of uncertainty because of geopolitical conflicts, protectionism, and disruptions in trade. Can you describe what exactly you're talking about with protections? Is it tariffs? Is it subsidies?
So firstly, I think we should recognize that the global economy has turned out to be quite resilient after some very hard knocks, and which is why we have growth at around 3.2% for this year and next. But looking ahead, there is a great deal of uncertainty. There are questions around what kind of policies will we have, depending upon the results of important elections, conflicts in the Middle East that could escalate, and you could see much wider regional tension, and oil prices could go up. What's going to happen to growth in China? That's another factor. So there are many risks. There's lots of uncertainty. Trade policy is also being discussed at these meetings quite heavily, and questions around that. All of this are risks that we see looking ahead.
How much is the U.S. election dominating every discussion that you have with everyone?
you know, it is very important. What happens in the U.S. matters for the U.S. and matters for the whole world. So as you can imagine, it is an important part of the conversation.
Is it making people feel paralyzed? And I'm talking about policymakers, and I'm talking about, you know, investors. Is it making people feel like they can't really make any moves until there are some outcomes for some of the big events and the elections that are coming down the pike?
When you see the data, you don't really get that impression that people are paralyzed. If you look at the U.S. economy and how it's doing, you know, consumption is doing very well. Labor markets are doing well, even though they've slowed some. And the financial markets are very strong. Financial conditions are easy. So you aren't seeing any, you know, negative knocks coming from that uncertainty right now. But yes, I think as we get closer to it, that goes up. And we'll see what comes after that.
Yeah, and I was speaking with the Bundesbank president this morning, and he was talking about how it's hard for him to really gauge some of the inflation risks, because for them, inflation would be a lot higher. Do you feel like that's the case, that interest rates are going to have to go up more significantly as more tariffs go into place?
What we do know is that tariffs are inflationary. They do put pressure on prices. That's usually what we see in the data, looking at past episodes of tariffs that have been put in place, right? In addition, there is a very important question of what the stance of fiscal policy is going to be around the world and how expansionary it's going to be. The U.S. economy is very strong right now. At the same time, we are seeing inflation coming down, and our expectation is that it will continue to do so, and the Fed will continue to cut rates. Now, if there is a much more expansionary fiscal stance, you know, that could move the argument in a different direction.
Are you surprised that interest rates, I don't want to say interest rates, that 10-year treasury yields, that the benchmark treasury yields on the longer term, or even just globally, aren't reflecting more the $100 trillion of global debt that you've reflected in your latest IMF projection?
The rate is going for the U.S. debt is going to also be a function of the strength of the U.S. economy, the strength of its institutions, and there's tremendous faith in that. Again, the U.S. economy is one of the strongest among the major economies, if you look at those. And when we compare the U.S. to the other G20 economies, it's the only economy whose GDP is higher now than we had projected before the pandemic. The only major economy. So it's a very strong economy, a lot of confidence in it, and that's showing up in the yield numbers too.
What I find amazing is that we talk about how well things are going, and I got a sense from you. You said before you start talking about the risks, the economy is doing really well. Understand this. Is there almost this sense of, why are people not feeling that? Why is that not reflected in the sentiment on the ground in so many surveys, given the fact that the data, it looks pretty much like Goldilocks, like soft landing, all these things that people hoped for?
Well, the fact is that we have inflation coming down, but the price level now is much higher than it was a couple of years ago. And for people and their consumption baskets, they look at what the price level is and they say, well, prices are much higher, even though their incomes have gone up too, which is why you see consumption holding up very well. But there's a lot of salience of what the price level is when you go to the grocery store and your basket of goods and how much they cost. And I think that's having an effect on sentiment. But I think we do have to recognize that, you know, in the past, when central banks have tried to bring down inflation from the kind of high levels we've seen, it's been much more disruptive to economies. This is quite unique that we're having inflation coming down, and we are likely to see a soft landing.
You also talk about trade policy, and I want to go there because right now, at the same time that we're at these meetings in Washington, D.C., there is a conference going on in Russia with the BRICS, right? The different countries, Brazil, Russia, India, as well as China. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are there. A lot of the delegates from China are not here, they are there. Is that concerning to you?
So let me give you a fact that I think will help assuage a bunch of concerns. Just very recently, our members, 190 of our members, they had to all agree to this on a particular reform that would help the IMF support to low-income countries. All 190 member countries of the IMF supported this. That just tells you that there's a lot of support from our members for the IMF, and they see a great deal of value in this institution. So, you know, we recognize that several of our members are parts of other groupings, but from our perspective, we see them very engaged with our own work.
How difficult is it to come up with statements that reflect a unified vision given that there's sort of a fractured world. I mean, we've talked about this. You did a lot of research on this that I think is really interesting about how there are parties that are kind of the third parties that are helping to be the conduit for trade between different countries that don't want to do business together. I mean, how is that making it difficult to sort of have the same role as you've had traditionally?
I mean, there's no doubt that geopolitical tensions are higher than we have seen in the past decades, and there are more countries questioning the value of all the close economic integration that we have had, questions of how to de-risk your supply chains, national security concerns. All of this is taking center stage, and that obviously has implications for any multilateral institutions. But I have to say this, that what I am very pleased with is how our members, all of them, are still working very closely at the IMF to push through important reforms for the world.
You talk about the developing world, and I'm wondering how much there is a convergence in your mind between activities in the developing world and in the developed world, especially with the deficit and some of the increase there, and that you're seeing the opposite in a number of developing countries where they're actually reducing debts and trying to be more disciplined.
Okay, so one of the points that we're making through these meetings is pointing to everybody that we have a problem because debt is very high and our projected growth, especially into the medium term, is not great. It's a low growth number. It's 3.1% as opposed to what it was for a few decades, which is around 3.8%. That is a problem, which means all countries, including advanced economies, need to act on that. What is true is that for developing countries, they don't really have a choice. You know, there's a lot of pressure coming from the markets. They have high debt servicing costs. We are concerned about liquidity issues in several countries, and that, you know, is coming after these countries have accumulated large amounts of debt through the pandemic and the big increase in energy and food prices. So yes, there's differences, but that's always been the case. You know, countries like the U.S. can run much bigger deficits than developing countries can.
Do you think that the U.S. could face a Liz Truss moment?
U.S. debt is very sustainable. It is a strong economy. But all of that said, our advice to the U.S. is that it should have smaller deficits, given also that the economy is above potential and doing really well at this point of time. So bringing down the debt, and especially to build up for another shock or another crisis, which will come. We know this is not the last time we have a crisis.
Do you think that, just want to end here, this question about regime change, and that some people are saying that we're entering a new paradigm where there is a greater acceptance of protectionism, of trade tensions, of this question about who's friends with who and who's going to scratch who's back, but not necessarily the same sort of free trade era. Do you think that this is the beginning, the middle, or the end of that evolution?
Well, we certainly have changed in the sense that there was a time when countries were hyper-focused on efficiency, and when they were deciding who to trade with, the only question was which was the cheapest source to buy it from. Right now, they're stepping back and saying, well, we need to make sure our supply chains are secure, that we are not exposing ourselves to big risks, that there are not big national security concerns. That change is already happening, and you see that in the data. But it's still of a small magnitude. The question is, how much further down the path do we go? And that, I think, is uncertain.
Gita Gopinath, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate your insights. That's Gita Gopinath, the first Deputy Managing Director at the International Monetary Fund. Carol, I'm going to send it back to you.
All right, so appreciated. Of course, Bloomberg's TV Surveillance's co-host Lisa Abramowitz there with the IMF Deputy Managing Director. If you missed any of that interview, be sure to check it out on the Bloomberg or at Bloomberg.com. All right, that is a great view snapshot on, yes, the global economy, but also the U.S. economy. And right now we want to get a little bit deeper into what's going on in the United States. And this, Tim, as we've seen U.S. Treasury yields risen along with the odds of a Republican sweep at the November federal elections, which could mean deficit-funded growth and tariff-stoking inflation. It's something that Gita Gopinath just talked about, that the importance of U.S. debt, it's sustainable, but she also said that we should have less and that we need to be kind of ready for the next crisis when the government might need to take on more debt.
Okay, this is something on our next guest's radar, certainly. With a look at the U.S. economy, joining us here in our studio, we got Olu Omundunbi, chief economist over at Huntington Private Bank. It's a division of the publicly held Huntington Bank shares based over in Ohio. The bank has more than a $22 billion market cap. It's up 22% so far this year. Olu, welcome to Bloomberg. Good to have you with us. I just want to get right into it and talk politics. Are you guys at the bank setting up for a Harris win or a Trump win?
Thanks for having me. So, I mean, election is top of the mind for many businesses, consumers, investors. But we tell clients to focus on policies, not politics. So monetary policy, for example, what's the Fed going to do? We expect the Fed to cut the Fed's funds rate by 25 basis points at each of its meetings over the next couple of months. And we also expect about 4 cuts in 2025, which will be a boost to consumers and the broader economy.
Olu, let's stay with that. Policies get you. But if it's a Harris in the White House or it's a Trump in the White House, those policies could be dramatically different. And when it comes to the Federal Reserve, we've heard from former President Donald Trump talking about potentially interfering in what the Fed might do or not do. So that's really important. How do you strategize around that? What's the smart conversation you must be having as a bank around that?
No, absolutely. You know, we think the Fed works best in its current format, independent and being overseen by Congress. You know, we hope, you know, that's how it continues after we get election results, hopefully in 2 weeks. But we do, again, tell clients to just, you know, focus on, you know, what the Fed is going to do. In terms of fiscal policy, you know, that depends on what happens in the congressional elections. You know, once we know the results for that, then we can adjust our outlook. For now, we just tell clients to focus on Fed expectations, again, which is for 2 25 basis point cuts before the end of this year and about 4 25 basis point cuts next year.
Because we don't know the outcome of the election, are you not even sharpening your pencils at this point? Do you wait to do this analysis until we have the results of the election? Because one thing we do know is that these candidates want to spend and they don't want to raise taxes on a wide scale. And some of the analysis that we've seen from the CBO, for example, show that a Trump presidency would end up costing just trillions of dollars. And, you know, there are concerns about where that money's going to come from.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So things like tariffs, you know, that's going to be a tax on consumers. It's likely going to lead to higher inflation, especially if we get broader tariffs than what we got early on. But, you know, again, you know, we tell consumers to like just focus on things like, you know, what the Fed is going to do. And again, our view is that we're going to get 2 25 basis point cuts before the end of this year.
All right. So Geeta Gopinath of the IMF, Deputy Managing Director, just talking with our Lisa Abramowitz, said U.S. economy is among the strongest of major economies. What are you seeing at your bank and what you are seeing with your team when you guys look at the economy? What kind of economy do you see, and where are the strengths? Where are there some weaknesses?
Yeah, we think it's a good economy. We think that growth has been strong so far this year. 2024 is actually shaping up to be very similar to 2023. 2023 was supposed to be the year of the recession, but we got 3% growth, GDP growth. That was recently revised up.
So what are you economists doing wrong that you all keep calling for a recession? What is it that you keep missing?
Yeah, we weren't calling for a recession last year. We're calling for...
Were you the year before? Because they've been calling for a recession for a while.
I mean, there will be a recession at some point, but we don't think it's going to be in the next 12 months. But 2024, again, is shaping up to be a very good year for the U.S. economy. The labor market is solid.
So good that we start to see inflation rear its ugly head again?
I mean, that's a risk, right? So I think if the Fed cuts rates more aggressively than what we're forecasting, you know, we could see a reacceleration in inflation. If the geopolitical risks escalate further, you know, the Red Sea crisis, if we see more disruptions there, that could lead to inflation in goods and higher inflation again, and you know that could make the Fed restart its hiking cycle. But overall, it's a good economy. You know, inflation is going down, the labor market is solid, consumer balance sheets are good. Upper income consumers.
But the unemployment rate has gone up a fair amount in the last few months. We've watched that trend, and we know once it starts to go up, it can start to go up a lot.
That's a great point. It's gone up, but on a historical basis, it's still very low compared to, you know, where it was in 2020, for example, after the COVID recession. So it's a good labor market.
But the trend line is higher.
It's not as strong as it was in 2021 and 2022, but that was unsustainable. And talking about unsustainable, I also just want to get back to your point about the debt levels.
Yeah.
You know, we think that it's unsustainable in the medium to long term. It's a good U.S. economy, so.
What is the medium to long term, and when it's unsustainable, what are the repercussions of that?
So you get what you call like a crowd analysis effect, right? So that's when higher Treasury yields crowd out private investment. So if the budget deficit continues to increase at an unsustainable pace, we could see higher long-term rates, which again could crowd out private investments, and which will lead to a slower growing U.S. economy. So we think and we hope that the folks in Congress are able to fix that sooner than later.
An American voting public, like if you're going to have these major spending plans and you got to fund them somehow, right? You're going to crowd out eventually, especially in a higher rate environment, if we're paying the interest on the debt, we're not going to be able to do all these spending plans that everybody is kind of touting. I am curious because you're a part of a big publicly traded bank. We mentioned Huntington Bank shares. Bank has about a $22 billion market cap. It's up more than 20% year to date. We've talked a lot about the health of the banking sector. What do you glean from that side of the business in terms of lending and loans, what you are seeing, whether it's on the consumer side, the corporate side? What is that showing you?
Yeah, so we're headquartered in Columbus, Ohio, which brought it out of the Midwest, and we are a national bank, a growing bank. We're just expanding in 3 states, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Texas.
Right.
Top 20 bank in the U.S. And we're also the #1 SBA lender by volumes in the U.S. And we have been in this position for about 7 years. So we get a very unique view of the U.S. economy, particularly from small businesses. Most businesses are small businesses.
Right.
And what we're seeing is that performance has been pretty steady.
What does that mean, performance? What performance?
Like just margins have been pretty good for small businesses. Despite high interest rates and inflation, businesses are still performing very well. And they're looking forward to the rate cuts as that will be a boost in activity over the next couple of years.
Any pockets of concern, areas of concern that you see?
Yeah, so I think a risk is a Fed misstep. If the Fed cuts rates too aggressively, we could get a reacceleration in inflation, and we could get the Fed restarting its hiking cycle. Also, the geopolitical risks. That's also an area of concern.
When you say geopolitical risks, I know you mentioned what's happening in the Middle East, or you mentioned more so what's happening when it comes to shipping.
Sure.
Yeah, that's certainly top of mind for you. What about the Middle East, though?
That is a concern. Like if that escalates and if we see an increase in energy prices.
These are risks. These are not necessarily areas of weakness in the U.S. economy at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
Any areas of weakness in the U.S. economy?
Housing. So activity has been weak in the housing sector. Looking at housing starts, housing permits, existing home sales data just came out yesterday. So that's a weak sector of the U.S. economy. Manufacturing also is still weak. But these are very rate-sensitive sectors. So lower interest rates should help boost activity in the sectors. And we expect activity to improve in these sectors as rate cuts advance. So, once the Fed gets more advanced in its rate cutting cycle,
right,
we should see a better manufacturing and housing sectors.
All right, good. Good check on the U.S. economy. So appreciate it. Olu Omandumbi, he is chief economist at Huntington Private Bank, right here on Bloomberg Business Week. Still to come, the Trump whale, Tim.
I think this is like the most read story on the Bloomberg.
I think so too.
They spent more than $45 million on polymarket bets. Won't be voting in our election, though. We give you the details right after this.
we'll move from supervised full self-driving to unsupervised full self-driving, where the car, you could fall asleep and wake up at your destination. So, but there's also a challenge for a lot of people that cars cost too much. I mean, when you factor in everything that goes into a car, and the car insurance, and the car payments, and the storage of the car, it's very expensive. So, with and you said, like, how many hours a week are cars used? Your average passenger car is only used about 10 hours a week out of 168 hours. So the vast majority of the time, cars are just doing nothing. But if they're autonomous, they could be used, I don't know, 5 times more, maybe 10 times more. So you could actually, for the same car, would have 5 times as much value, maybe 10 times as much value. There's 168 hours in the week, and like I said, only 10 of them are used for driving. So, and then a bunch of those hours are looking for a parking spot, which is, can be pretty annoying at times. So we want, with autonomy, you get your time back. This is a very big deal. So it's not just it'll save lives, like a lot of lives, and prevent injuries. I think we'll see autonomous cars become 10 times safer than a human. I mean, if you think of times past where there used to be an elevator operator in every elevator, but once in a while they get tired and they accidentally shear somebody in half. So now we have automated elevators. You just get in an elevator and you press a button, and you don't even think about it. And it just takes you to the floor. And if you did see an elevator operator with a big relay switch, you'd be like, that's weird. Now that's how cars will be. And it's not just the lives saved in injuries, but if you think about the cumulative time that people spend in a car and the time that they will get back, that they can now spend, well, I guess on their phones or watching a movie or doing work or whatever you want to do. You can think of the car in an autonomous world as being like just a little lounge. You're just sitting in a comfortable little lounge, and you can do whatever you want while you're in this comfortable little lounge. And when you get out, you will be at your destination. So, yeah, it's going to be awesome. So.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome on Polymarket isn't an accurate reading of what the masses are kind of voting on and betting on and thinking that who will win on the election. We do have a little bit of a skew. So Polymarket is predicting Trump will win at about 61% at the minute, whereas if you look at other markets like Kalshi or Predictit, they're kind of around the 59%, 57% mark. So there's definitely a much bigger upswing, and it actually used to be a little bit more of a larger divide, but it's narrowed slightly in recent days. So you can kind of see there's a bit of an impact happening because of it, but you don't necessarily know if it's manipulating market. And then Polymarket did its own
what's going on in third quarter, and also give us an idea of what's happening with the small caps. So we're excited about that one. I mentioned the dean of the SDA